Tonight we begin our journey through the elegant, disciplined, and often brutally unforgiving world of Imperial China. Imagine a land where jade palaces and silken robes exist alongside swift beheadings for minor infractions, a civilization where exquisite tea ceremonies and magnificent poetry share space with a daily routine that would absolutely break most of us before breakfast. I invite you, before settling in, to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content I create. I'm always curious, where are you watching from? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Share in the comments below. Now might be the perfect moment to dim your lights and perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum that helps ease you into sleep. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In Imperial China, you don't wake up and choose your path. You wake up and it's already been chosen by birth, by blood, and by a cosmic order that stretches back thousands of years. Your role in society isn't a suggestion, it's a mandate from heaven itself. Were you born into a scholar official family? Lucky you. You're now responsible for memorizing thousands of classical texts just to have a chance at maintaining your status. Born a peasant? Congratulations. You'll be spending the next 40 years bent over rice paddies, paying taxes so crushing that saving enough to eat is considered a good year. And your children will too, forever. There is no social mobility. There is no follow your dreams. You're either a scholar, farmer, artisan, or merchant, and once you're placed, you stay there. Trying to jump ranks isn't just frowned upon, it's an offence against the cosmic order itself. You don't climb the social ladder in Imperial China, you kowtow to it. And we haven't even gotten to the mean people, the untouchables. Butchers, actors, executioners, and those who handle the dead. Society needs them but pretends they don't exist. They are like ghosts with jobs. Important jobs, but ghosts. Even within classes, it gets worse. Let's say you're a merchant, which sounds decent, right? You've got silver tails jangling in your pocket. But in Imperial China, you're near the bottom of the respectable classes. Why? Because you make money without producing anything tangible, which Confucian values consider morally suspect. Yes, you're literally too efficient to be respected. Meanwhile, the peasants are taxed so hard on their grain that if they pay in full, they starve. If they hide some to survive, that's treason. Heads roll regularly, and sometimes they're displayed on city gates as a reminder. Women, you didn't even ask, but no, you're not getting out of this either. Whatever your class, your freedom ends where your father's, husband's, or son's opinions begin. You'll marry who you're told, obey whom you must, and thank the ancestors if your bones are only broken in your feet and not your spirit. So yes, you're born assigned a costume and a script and shoved onto the stage of Chinese society whether you want to perform or not. It's elegant, poetic, and crushingly inescapable, and that's all before you've had your morning rice porridge. The civilization that gave the world silk, gunpowder, printing, and paper also perfected the art of social control so thoroughly that it survived for millennia. You wouldn't last a day in Imperial China not because you're weak, but because you were never trained for the marathon of ritualized behavior, physical hardship, and absolute submission that daily life required. Your modern ideas about individual rights, personal expression, and questioning authority would get you executed before sunset. And in Imperial China, your execution wouldn't just be about ending your life, it would be about restoring cosmic harmony through your carefully documented suffering. Welcome to a world where bureaucracy and brutality walked hand in hand, where poetry was political, and where surviving until tomorrow meant perfectly navigating a labyrinth of social rules today. Welcome to Imperial China, where lasting was the only purpose, and you, my friend, wouldn't. Now that you understand your place in the cosmic hierarchy of Imperial China, somewhere between insignificant and unfortunate, let's look at the very top of that pyramid. The Emperor, the Son of Heaven, the one human being with a direct line to the divine. Sounds impressive, right? Ultimate power, ultimate luxury. Everyone bowing before you, your every whim catered to. Except that's not quite how it worked. Being Emperor of China was perhaps the most gilded cage ever designed. Let's start with the basics. The Emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was the living bridge between heaven and earth, the human pivot on which the cosmic order turned. One misstep from him, one improper sacrifice, one poorly timed ceremony, and the entire universe could fall out of balance. Droughts, floods, earthquakes. Those weren't natural disasters. They were heaven's disapproval of the Emperor's moral failings. Imagine carrying that on your shoulders while trying to manage a bureaucracy spanning a territory larger than Europe. Your day as emperor begins before dawn, not because you choose to wake early, but because the Book of Rights requires it. You're surrounded by eunuchs, men who've sacrificed their manhood to serve in your private quarters. They dress you because touching yourself inappropriately would diminish your sacred aura. You can't just throw on silk pajamas and shuffle to breakfast. Each layer of your dragon robes represents cosmic principles. Put them on wrong, congratulations, you've just insulted your ancestors and possibly caused crop failure in 3 provinces. Now you head to your morning audience. Hope you enjoyed breakfast because you'll spend the next 4 hours kneeling on a raised platform while officials present memorials, essentially government reports and requests. These aren't quick bullet point summaries. There are elaborate essays filled with classical allusions, each crafted to showcase the writer's erudition while technically addressing administrative matters. You must appear to understand every reference, consider every petition, all while maintaining the facial expression of someone who simultaneously embodies divine wisdom and human compassion. Are you hungry yet? Too bad. Imperial meals are ceremonial affairs, not casual dining. Your food is prepared by multiple teams of chefs, then tasted by food testers, because assassination attempts are an occupational hazard. You eat alone, as almost no one is considered worthy to dine with the Son of Heaven. Each dish symbolizes something cosmic or historic or poetic. You can't just enjoy your dumplings. You need to appreciate how they represent the unity of heaven and earth through the perfect balance of wrapper and filling. Want to take a break? Maybe spend time with your family? Which family would that be? You have an empress or multiple consorts ranked in elaborate tiers, and potentially dozens of children who are simultaneously your offspring and political chess pieces. Your empress isn't necessarily someone you chose or even like. She was selected for her family connections and ability to navigate court politics. Your concubines compete for your attention not out of passion, but because bearing your son could elevate their status from decorative captive to mother of the future emperor. Speaking of sons, they're not just your children, they're succession candidates. The smart ones will form alliances, study diligently, and prepare to rule. The ambitious ones might plot against you. The bitter ones might turn to drink or gambling. Any of them could become the focus of court factions seeking to influence the succession. Your greatest achievement, having a son, is also potentially your greatest threat. Perhaps the most suffocating aspect of his imperial power was the court itself. Around you swirled factions and cliques, the eunuchs who controlled access to your private quarters, the scholar officials who implemented policy, the imperial relatives who felt entitled to influence, and the military commanders whose loyalty was essential yet always suspect. Everyone watched everyone else. Conversations were rarely direct, messages were conveyed through classical allusions, gift-giving and strategic appointments. Want to escape? Good luck. Your movements are dictated by court ritual and security concerns. Even garden strolls follow prescribed routes. Travel outside the palace required months of preparation, hundreds of attendants, and disrupted government function. The summer palace existed because even emperors needed vacations, but your vacation still involved morning audiences, ceremonial duties, and the constant watchful eyes of officials recording your every word for the court histories. This brings us to perhaps the most crushing burden of imperial power. You weren't just being watched by the living. Your every action was evaluated against the standard of previous emperors, particularly the semi-mythical sage rulers of antiquity. Court historians documented everything, your edicts, your remarks, your behavior during rituals, knowing these records would be consulted by future generations judging your reign. Your legacy wasn't yours to shape. It belonged to historians who would determine whether you were remembered as benevolent or tyrannical, wise or foolish. Even your death didn't free you from responsibility. Your tomb was prepared while you lived, cheery reminder of mortality, designed to house not just your remains, but the symbolic continuation of your rule in the afterlife. Elaborate burial goods, sacrificial rituals, and architectural alignments all ensured you'd continue serving as the cosmic pivot even after your physical form had returned to the elements. So yes, being Emperor of China meant absolute power, the ability to elevate or destroy anyone in your realm with a mere word. But that power came encased in ritual so rigid it would make modern prisons seem freeing by comparison. Your palace was really an office you could never leave. Your servants were really handlers making sure you fulfilled your cosmic obligations. Your family was really a collection of political entities related to you by blood or marriage. The emperor embodied a paradox. Supreme authority coupled with minimal freedom. The Son of Heaven could command armies, redirect rivers, and build monuments that would last millennia. But he couldn't skip his morning ceremony, speak plainly instead of in classical allusions, or marry for love instead of political advantage. You wouldn't survive a day as Emperor of China not because the job was physically demanding, but because the weight of cosmic responsibility, ritual precision, and constant surveillance would crush your modern sensibilities like a dragon boots on an ant. The most powerful man in the world was also its most constrained, proving once again that in Imperial China, no one was truly free, not even the one who supposedly owned it all. If the Emperor was trapped in a gilded cage of cosmic responsibility, at least he had the gold. The rest of Imperial Chinese society was just as rigidly structured, but with considerably fewer perks and an equal number of ways to get yourself killed for stepping out of line. Let's wade into the exquisitely ordered swamp of social hierarchy that would have sorted, labelled, and confined you from the moment of birth. The entire social order of Imperial China was built on a four-tiered system that sounds deceptively simple. The scholar officials, SSI, the farmers, Nong, the artisans, Gong, and the merchants, Shang. Notice something strange already? The rich merchants ranked below dirt-poor farmers. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional Confucian design that valued production over profit. Farmers created food from soil and sweat. Artisans created objects from raw materials. Scholars created order from chaos through moral leadership. But merchants? They just moved things around and skimmed money off the top. How terribly unvirtuous. Let's start at the top with the scholar officials. These weren't just educated men, they were the human embodiment of moral authority. Having memorized the Confucian classics word for word, mastered calligraphy, poetry, and ritual precision, they'd passed the infamous imperial examinations. That alone deserves respect. Imagine spending decades studying texts written in an archaic language, memorizing thousands of characters, and composing essays on moral philosophy, all to compete against tens of thousands of other candidates for perhaps a dozen government positions. The exam halls were more brutal than modern prisons, with candidates locked in tiny cells for days, some dying from stress, others going mad from pressure. Those who succeeded entered government service. They wore specific colours and badges of rank, spoke with cultivated accents, and wielded power through a bureaucracy that stretched from the imperial palace down to the smallest village. But don't envy them too quickly. They lived under constant scrutiny. One poorly worded memorandum, one misstep in ritual, one hint of corruption, and they would be demoted, exiled, or executed. The higher they climbed, the further they could fall. Many officials carried poison as a preferable alternative to public disgrace, better a dignified suicide than bringing shame to your ancestors. Below them stood the farmers, the theoretical backbone of society. In Confucian philosophy, these humble tillers of soil were more valuable than wealthy merchants because they produced the food that sustained civilization. Such noble sentiment, such honourable work, such complete hypocrisy. In practice, farmers were taxed to the point of starvation, forced into corvée labour projects, and left vulnerable to bandits, soldiers, and corrupt local officials. A good year meant having enough grain stored to survive winter. A bad year meant selling your children to survive. Farmers lived on a subsistence knife edge. The land tax took up to half their produce. Rent to landlords took another substantial chunk. Natural disasters meant death unless government granaries opened, and those often remained locked even during famines. Local magistrates were more concerned with meeting tax quotas than preventing starvation. If you complained too loudly, that was sedition, punishable by execution. The philosophical respect given to agriculture never translated into actual respect for agricultural workers. The artisans occupied the third rank: carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and other skilled craftspeople. Their status came from creating useful objects rather than merely trading them. Many belonged to hereditary guilds, learning trade secrets passed down through generations. Their lives were hand-to-mouth, but had more certainty than farmers, less dependent on weather, and more on demand for their products. But don't imagine they were free. Their trades were often hereditary, their movements restricted, their techniques regulated by tradition. Innovation was discouraged unless it came from the top down. Make pottery exactly as your ancestors did. Any deviation might suggest their methods were imperfect, which would be disrespectful. Now for the merchants, officially the bottom of the respectable ladder, yet often secretly the wealthiest. The philosophical disdain for commerce created a bizarre situation where the richest people in some regions ranked below virtually everyone else. A merchant could wear silk while a scholar official wore cotton, yet the merchant would still kowtow to the scholar. Commerce was considered non-productive, a necessary evil rather than a respected profession. This didn't stop the merchant families from accumulating vast fortunes, of course. They simply couldn't translate that wealth into official status, except through one crucial escape hatch: education. A wealthy merchant family could invest in their son's education, preparing them for the imperial examinations. If the son passed, he became a scholar official, elevating the family's status. This wasn't quick or easy. It took generations of strategic investment. Meanwhile, merchant families lived in a strange limbo, materially comfortable but socially inferior, always one misstep away from being labelled as exploitative and having their assets seized. But wait, we've only covered the respectable classes. Below even the merchants existed the mean people: actors, prostitutes, slaves, boat dwellers, butchers, tanners, executioners, and others who handled things considered ritually unclean. These people were legally and socially inferior. They couldn't take the imperial examinations, marry outside their status, or wear certain clothes. In some dynasties, they were required to wear specific markers identifying their lowly status. They lived in segregated neighbourhoods, used separate wells, and were forbidden from entering government offices through the main gate. What determined your place in this rigid hierarchy? Primarily birth. Born to a farmer? You're a farmer. Born to a blacksmith? Enjoy the forge. Social mobility existed in theory, but remained rare in practice. The most common path upward was the examination system, which theoretically allowed anyone, well, any male, from a respectable family to become a scholar official based on merit rather than birth. In reality, only families with enough resources to support years of education could produce successful candidates. Poor farm boys rarely made it to the examination hall, let alone passed. The system was designed for stability, not opportunity. Each person had a designated role that served the greater harmony of society. Stepping outside that role wasn't just unusual, it was disruptive, potentially catastrophic. Individual desires meant nothing compared to social order. Your personal talents, dreams, and ambitions were irrelevant unless they aligned precisely with your prescribed position. So no, you wouldn't last a day in Imperial China's social hierarchy. Not because you couldn't learn the rules, there were thousands, and they changed depending on who you were addressing, but because the very concept of social mobility as we understand it today didn't exist. The question wasn't, what do you want to be when you grow up? But how will you fulfill the role you were born into? You don't climb the ladder in Imperial China. You kowtow to it, polish it, and eventually die on the same rung where you began. If you thought being a merchant or a mean person in Imperial China was restrictive, at least you could walk outside with your natural feet. Women faced an entirely different dimension of confinement, where physical mobility, social agency, and personal desire were crushed beneath silken layers of restriction. Half of China's population lived in decorative house arrest, their value measured in 3-inch golden lotuses and silent obedience. Let's start with the most infamous aspect, foot binding. Imagine being a girl, perhaps 6 years old. Your mother explains that today is important. Your feet will transform from functional appendages into symbols of beauty and marriageability. She unwraps cloth bandages and begins the process that will define your life. Your toes, except the big toe, are folded under the sole. The arch is broken as the foot is bent double. Bandages are wrapped tightly, forcing toes and heel together. Every few days, bandages are removed, dead flesh cleaned away, and fresh, tighter bandages applied. The pain is excruciating. You cry for months. Walking becomes agony. Your mother persists because natural feet would make you unmarriageable, a burden to your family, a shame to your ancestors. After 2 years, your feet become the coveted 3-inch golden lotuses. Your crushed appendages no longer resemble feet. There are tiny stumps, toes fused to heel, arch permanently broken. You'll never run again. You'll walk with a swaying gait men find alluring, because it strengthens inner thigh muscles and forces small steps. You're physically incapable of travelling far without assistance. That's not a bug, it's a feature. Foot binding wasn't just about beauty, it was about control. A woman with bound feet couldn't escape her husband's house. She depended on others for basic mobility. She was literally crippled by cultural expectations. Surely elite women were treated better? Yes and no. Upper-class women avoided physical labour, but faced other confinements. The inner chambers weren't just architectural, they were existential. Respectable women remained in female quarters, away from unrelated men. Your world as an elite woman was beautiful but microscopic. A few rooms, perhaps a garden. Your company consisted of female relatives, servants, and occasionally your husband, though he likely spent more time with male friends or concubines. Your worth was measured by embroidery skills, household management, and producing sons. Daughters were disappointments to marry off quickly. Sons were your retirement plan, status symbols, and contribution to your husband's lineage. Even emotions were regulated. The 3 obediences and 4 virtues governed female behaviour. You obeyed your father before marriage, husband during marriage, son after your husband's death. The virtues, morality, proper speech, modest appearance, diligent work, meant maintaining pleasantness regardless of feelings. Displays of jealousy, anger, or ambition were unforgivable character flaws. The ideal woman was like flowing water, transparent, yielding, voiceless. Literature praised women sacrificing themselves for male relatives. The highest compliment was being virtuous and talented. Virtuous meaning sexually pure and obedient. Talented meaning skilled at feminine arts, but never too educated. A woman with too much knowledge was like a hen crowing at dawn, unnatural and inauspicious. Courtship and marriage. Not concepts you'd recognise. Marriage was a transaction between families. You might never see your husband until the wedding day. Your bride's veil wasn't removed until the wedding night, symbolising transfer from one male honneur to another. Your father-in-law had more authority over you than your husband. Your most dangerous adversary, your mother-in-law. Mothers-in-law wielded near absolute power over sons' wives. She could assign the hardest tasks, criticise everything, even beat you with impunity. Why such cruelty? Because she endured the same in her youth. Your only escape was surviving long enough to become a mother-in-law yourself, a system turning victims into perpetrators across generations. Reproduction wasn't private but a family obligation. Your worth depended on producing male heirs. Failed to conceive? Your husband could take concubines. Only daughters? You were unlucky or cursed. Multiple sons made you respected, but a son passing imperial examinations made you venerated. Failing to produce sons wasn't just disappointing, it was a moral failure, threatening the ancestral lineage. Even death offered no dignity. Widow chastity was glorified. The ideal widow remained faithful to her deceased husband, raising his children and serving his parents until her death. Remarriage, especially for upper-class women, was dishonourable. Some widows were pressured into suicide to demonstrate devotion. Memorial arches celebrated women who killed themselves rather than remarry, or who died defending chastity. Your greatest value might come after death, as a symbol of female virtue. Were there exceptions? Of course. History records remarkable women who wrote poetry, influenced politics through male relatives, managed businesses, or led rebellions. But these exceptions proved the rule. For every Wang Zhenyi studying astronomy, or Wu Zetian seizing power, millions lived and died within prescribed roles, talents undeveloped, voices unheard. The most heartbreaking aspect wasn't just the physical pain or restrictions, it was how thoroughly women internalized their subjugation. Mothers bound daughters' feet believing it necessary for future happiness. Women policed other women's behaviour more strictly than men did. The prison was built of silk and Confucian precepts, but the most effective guards were the prisoners themselves. You wouldn't survive a day as a woman in Imperial China not because the physical pain would break you, though it might, but because the psychological conditioning required to accept such extreme limitation began in infancy and continued until death. A woman's virtue was measured by her invisibility, pain tolerance, and silence. In modern terms, you'd call it systematic abuse. In Imperial China, they called it tradition. So you've navigated cosmic hierarchy, understood your social rank, and if you're a woman, learned to walk on broken feet. But the day has barely begun. In Imperial China, simply waking up was a ritualized performance that would exhaust most modern people before sunrise. Morning wasn't just the beginning of a day, it was the social order distilled into actions nobody could ignore. Let's start with when you woke up. Forget alarms or sleeping in. You rose with the sun, not because it was natural, but because the Book of Rites demanded it. Rising late wasn't a schedule preference, it was a moral failing. The emperor performed dawn ceremonies, so how dare you, a mere subject, stay nestled in your blankets? For officials and scholars, pre-dawn rising was mandatory. Early hours, 5-7 a.m., were considered auspicious for study. Sleep through these hours, you're disrupting cosmic harmony. For farmers, this schedule was practical. Fields needed tending before heat. For everyone else, it was philosophical torture masquerading as virtue. Even during northern winters, when temperatures plunged below freezing, you'd peel yourself from your bed platform, brick or stone, with thin padding, and begin rituals that prepared you for existence in a society where every action reflected moral worth. First came washing, but not the luxurious hot shower you imagine. Morning ablutions involved cold water carried from wells or streams, often through snow or mud, heated if you had fuel to spare. The wealthy might have servants prepare warm water with herbs, but everyone faced the fundamental problem: no indoor plumbing. Every drop had to be carried, heated, and disposed of. This made bathing a luxury rather than daily habit. Still, cleanliness was essential. Face and hands were washed daily, with fuller bathing less frequent. Even peasants maintained basic hygiene, not from germ awareness, but because cleanliness had moral significance. Dirtiness wasn't unpleasant, it signaled spiritual failing. With face washed and teeth cleaned using twigs or salt, the next ritual began: ancestor worship. Before addressing living family, you approached the family altar, a shrine found in every home. Here, tablets inscribed with ancestors' names received your first bow. You might light incense, offer tea or food, and report significant events. Skip this, you're not just being rude to dead relatives, you're severing the spiritual connection, giving your family identity and protection. This veneration wasn't optional. It formed the foundation of Chinese spirituality. Your ancestors weren't gone. They watched, judged, potentially helped or hindered family fortunes based on your behavior. That mourning bow maintained an active relationship with spirits who defined your lineage. Once ancestors were acknowledged, living family members received respect in hierarchical order. Children bowed to parents, younger siblings bowed to elder siblings, wives bowed to husbands, everyone bowed to grandparents. These weren't casual nods, they were formal prostrations physically enacting your family position. The discomfort wasn't a bug, it was a feature, reminding you that individual comfort meant nothing compared to proper social relations. For scholar officials, mourning might include reading classical texts before breakfast. For merchants, checking accounts. For artisans, stoking fires and preparing tools. For farmers, heading straight to fields, often without substantial breakfast, saving their main meal for midday. Speaking of breakfast, for baguette, cereal or toast, the morning meal was simple but code-laden. Rice porridge formed the staple, perhaps with pickled vegetables, salted eggs or leftovers. What you ate, how it was prepared, and when you consumed it reflected status. The emperor's breakfast included specialized dishes prepared by multiple kitchens, inspected for poison. A peasant's breakfast might be watery gruel eaten quickly before fieldwork. Even seating arrangements enforced hierarchy. The family patriarch sat in the position of honor, typically facing the door or at the table head. Others arranged themselves by status and age. Certain dishes served first to certain members. Speaking during meals was limited, with children often forbidden from initiating conversation. The meal wasn't for bonding, it was another ceremony where form trumped connection. After breakfast came official duties. For women, household management, organising servants if wealthy, or beginning endless domestic labour if not. For men, heading to fields, workshops, shops, or government offices, but you couldn't just throw on clothes and rush out. Your appearance required careful attention because it announced your exact position. Hair had to be properly arranged. For men in most dynasties, this meant a top knot, often with pins indicating status. For women, elaborate hairstyles could take an hour or more, with different styles for different ages and positions. During the Qing dynasty, men were required to shave the front of their heads and wear the rest in a queue, a Manchu practice forcibly imposed on the Han Chinese. Refusing this hairstyle wasn't a fashion choice, it was treasonous. Clothing followed equally rigid protocols. Colours, materials, and patterns were regulated by rank. Wear the wrong shade of yellow? That could be a capital offence if it resembled imperial colours. Your belt, hat, shoes, even ornaments announced precisely who you were. Dressing inappropriately wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was identity theft. disrupting the visual system that allowed everyone to know their place. By the time you were fully dressed, had honoured spirits and family, eaten according to station, and prepared mentally for duties, several hours had passed. And you hadn't begun actual work. These crushing morning rituals weren't just about tradition, they were about control, reminding you that every aspect of existence was prescribed by a system designed to maintain order. For the emperor, morning began with ceremonial reports confirming heaven's patterns remained undisturbed. For officials, morning included meditation on classical texts. For merchants, checking finances and planning transactions within regulations. For artisans, preparing materials according to guild specifications unchanged for centuries. For farmers, back-breaking labour from first light. For women, attending to household needs while remaining invisible. The morning wasn't yours, it belonged to a system using ritual as control. Each gesture, word and bite performed exactly as tradition demanded was another thread binding you to a social order, prioritising collective harmony over individual expression. The ritual wasn't the means, it was the end itself. By performing these prescribed actions, you weren't just preparing for the day, you were becoming a properly ordered subject. You wouldn't survive a morning in Imperial China not because the tasks were impossible, though exhausting, but because ritual's crushing weight would make you scream for the simple freedom to just wake up without performing an elaborate ceremony reaffirming your cosmic place. Imperial China, just waking up didn't exist, only proper or improper performance of your role in the eternal theatre of cosmic order. Let's talk about clothing in Imperial China, where your outfit wasn't self-expression. It was a walking billboard announcing your exact coordinates in the social universe. After spending your morning in ritual observance and carefully navigating the hierarchy at breakfast, you now face the complex task of dressing yourself, or more accurately, allowing yourself to be dressed according to rules established centuries before your birth. You think modern dress codes are restrictive? In Imperial China, they had sumptuary laws, government regulations dictating exactly what you could wear based on your rank, and breaking them wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a criminal offence punishable by beating or worse. These laws controlled everything: fabrics, colours, decorative patterns, even the number of ornaments you could display. The government had entire ministries devoted to making sure no one dressed above their station. Let's start with the most dangerous colour in your wardrobe: yellow. Not just any yellow, imperial yellow. The specific golden shade reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wear it without authorization, and you're not making a bold fashion choice, you're committing treason. Even accidental approximations could get you questioned. Imagine being executed because your tunic was a bit too sunny. Purple and bright red weren't far behind in the colours that might kill you category, similarly restricted to high-ranking officials and imperial family members. Imagine waking up each morning and calculating the political implications of wearing blue versus green, silk versus cotton, dragons versus phoenixes. Each element of your outfit communicated volumes to anyone who saw you. 5-clawed dragons, emperor only. 4 claws, high nobility. 3 claws, lower-ranking officials. Get it wrong and face consequences ranging from public humiliation to imprisonment, all because you embroidered one too many talons on your festival robe. The fabrics themselves formed their own hierarchy. Silk, the most prized textile, was restricted based on grade and quality. The finest silk gauze and brocade were reserved for the imperial family and highest officials. You might be wealthy enough to afford it, but if you were a merchant, wearing the wrong grade of silk could earn you 80 strokes with a bamboo cane. Sorry about your shattered femur, but those were the fashion police of the day, and they didn't issue warnings. 005. And don't forget the seasonal regulations. Certain garments could only be worn during specific times of year, regardless of actual weather conditions. Start wearing your summer clothes too early or winter clothes too late, and you weren't just uncomfortable, you were making an illegal statement about the emperor's calendar. The court announced seasonal wardrobe changes, and everyone followed suit, quite literally, even if you were freezing in spring silks during a late cold snap. For women, the restrictions piled even higher. Remember those bound feet we discussed earlier? Now try balancing on them while wearing multiple layers of heavy silk, elaborate headdresses weighing several pounds, and enough hairpins to supply a small metalworker's shop. A high-status Han Chinese woman might need 2 to 3 hours just to be properly dressed and coiffed, with several servants helping. And those tiny steps weren't just because of your broken feet. Your skirts were deliberately designed to restrict movement, keeping you decorative and immobile. Hairstyles weren't just fashion choices, they were political statements. When the Manchu conquered China and established the Qing dynasty, they forced all Han Chinese men to adopt the queue, head shaved at the front with a long braid at the back. Refusing this hairstyle wasn't expressing individuality. It was resisting the new regime, punishable by death. The saying went, "Keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and cut your hair." That's fashion compliance with actual teeth. Even your accessories were regulated. The number of pearls on a hairpin, the material of your belt buckle, the design on your shoes, all prescribed according to your rank. Officials wore Mandarin squares on their robes, embroidered badges showing their precise rank within the bureaucracy. Birds for civil officials, animals for military. Imagine wearing your job performance review on your chest for everyone to see. And here's the true irony. After all that regulation, all that precision about what you could and couldn't wear, most people owned barely 2 outfits. Peasants wore rough hemp or cotton, dyed blue or brown with plant materials because that's all they could afford. Their clothes were patched repeatedly until they disintegrated. While court ladies changed outfits multiple times daily, a farmer might wear the same tunic for years until it literally fell off his body. Think you could just stay home and dress comfortably? Think again. Even your private attire was regulated. Proper inner garments, sleeping clothes, and domestic wear all had prescriptions. There was no casual Friday, no loungewear, no concept of dressing down. Every moment of your life required appropriate attire, reflecting your station, your age, your marital status, and the current political climate. Preparation was constant. Clothes required endless maintenance with primitive tools. Silks needed careful handling and storage to prevent damage. Laundry was done by laboriously beating clothing on rocks in cold streams or with wooden implements. Wrinkles were smoothed using heavy metal irons heated over coals. One wrong move and your precious silk was scorched beyond repair, leaving you financially ruined and improperly dressed. Your clothing wasn't just what you wore, it was who you were allowed to be. It announced your identity before you spoke a word, locked you into your assigned role, and ensured you never forgot your place in the cosmic order. So yes, you took those extra minutes each morning to ensure every fold was correct, every colour appropriate, every ornament properly positioned. Your physical comfort was irrelevant. What mattered was visual compliance with a system designed to be immediately legible to anyone who saw you. Your clothing wasn't self-expression, it was a uniform announcing exactly where you belonged in the cosmos. And like everything else in Imperial China, it wasn't designed for your convenience or comfort. It was another elaborate cage disguised as silk and embroidery, beautiful but absolutely unforgiving. You've navigated the morning rituals, survived the suffocating hierarchies, and somehow managed to dress without committing a capital fashion crime. Now comes another treacherous domain in Imperial China, mealtime. If you thought food was simply about sustenance or, heaven forbid, pleasure, you're already setting yourself up for failure. Like your clothing, your food wasn't just what you consumed, it was another elaborate performance of status, virtue, and cosmic harmony. Let's start with the imperial table, where eating wasn't dining, it was theatre on a scale that would make Broadway productions look like elementary school plays. The emperor never ate alone. Each meal featured dozens, sometimes hundreds of dishes prepared by an army of specialized chefs. But here's the twist. He would barely touch most of them. These elaborate spreads weren't about satisfying hunger. They were displays of abundance, power, and the empire's reach. Palace kitchens employed thousands of guimuras with specific tasks, some who only made broths, others dedicated solely to slicing vegetables in precise dimensions. One wrong cut, one imperfect seasoning, and you might find yourself demoted, beaten, or worse. The emperor's food underwent multiple inspections for poison, not just by guards but by designated food tasters who would sample each dish before it reached the imperial lips. Being a food taster was essentially agreeing to die first if something was amiss, not exactly a coveted promotion. For the emperor, meals followed strict protocols. Dishes arrived in prescribed sequences, served from specific angles, with ceremonial announcements. He ate with jade chopsticks that supposedly changed colour if poison was present. Every bite carried political weight. Refuse a regional specialty, and you might insult an entire province. Appear too enthusiastic about food, and you seemed undignified. Show too little appetite, and courtiers would whisper about your declining health, potentially destabilizing markets or encouraging coup plotters. Meanwhile, for the vast majority of the population, food was a much simpler proposition. Get enough to avoid starvation. Rice formed the backbone of Chinese cuisine. But it wasn't equally available to everyone. White rice was for the privileged. The common people made do with less processed grains, often mixed with wild plants, beans, or whatever could extend the precious staple. During famines, people resorted to eating bark, roots, and clay mixed with chaff just to feel full while slowly starving. Regional variations existed across this vast empire, of course. Northern cuisine relied more on wheat, producing noodles, dumplings, and steamed buns. Southern cooking featured rice and seafood. Western regions incorporated more lamb and mutton with Islamic influences, but regardless of region, one principle remained constant. You ate what your status allowed. Sumptuary laws didn't just govern clothing, they regulated food consumption too. Certain foods were explicitly reserved for the elite. During the Ming dynasty, commoners were forbidden from consuming seafood like sea cucumber or shark fin, delicacies reserved for the upper classes. Even fruits had hierarchies. Lychees, for instance, became an imperial obsession during the Tang dynasty, with Emperor Xuanzong establishing a special horse relay to rush fresh lychees from the south to his consort Yang Guifei. The resources spent delivering fresh fruit across 1,000 miles could have fed entire villages, but imperial desire trumped practical concerns every time. For those fortunate enough to rise above subsistence, dining became an intricate dance of etiquette. The proper guest waited to be seated according to rank, never began eating before the host knew exactly which dishes to compliment, and understood the precise amount to leave uneaten. Clean your plate completely, and you suggested your host didn't provide enough. Leave too much, and you implied the food was unappetizing. Every gesture communicated something about your breeding and education. Even the seating arrangements were significant. The place of honor faced the entrance or was the furthest from the door, depending on the region. Being seated in the wrong position could be a deliberate slight or an embarrassing mistake. Imagine the anxiety of attending a formal dinner where your seat assignment might communicate an insult you never intended to make. Family meals weren't casual affairs either. They operated as miniature models of the social hierarchy. The patriarch sat in the position of honor and was served first. Sons ate in order of their birth rank. Women often ate separately or after the men had finished, sometimes receiving lower quality portions. Even the order in which you picked up your chopsticks was prescribed by age and status. Try explaining to your father-in-law why you reached for food before he did. That conversation wouldn't go well. The actual mechanics of eating came with their own invisible rulebook. Slurping noodles was acceptable, even complimentary to the chef, but belching or making other bodily noises could bring shame to your ancestors. Chopsticks were never to be stuck vertically into rice, resembling incense for the dead, never used to point at others, and never used to dig around searching for preferred bits in a communal dish. Each transgression marked you as uncultured or worse, ill-omened. Famine remained a constant shadow over Chinese society. Even in good years, most peasants lived one bad harvest away from starvation. Imperial granaries theoretically provided reserves for lean times, but corruption and logistics meant relief often arrived too late or not at all. You might spend a lifetime watching your portion sizes shrink during winter, wondering if spring would arrive before your food ran out. Millions didn't survive this annual calculation. Meanwhile, as peasants counted individual grains, the elite developed elaborate banquet traditions. During the Qing dynasty, the most formal imperial feast, Manchu Han Full Banquet, featured over 300 dishes served across 3 days. Delicacies included camel hump, bear paw, monkey brain, and rhinoceros tail, not because they tasted exceptional, but because their rarity and difficulty to obtain demonstrated wealth and influence. Consuming conspicuously was a political statement. Even religious dietary restrictions became competitive. Buddhist vegetarian cuisine developed increasingly sophisticated mock meats, sculpting tofu and vegetables to resemble forbidden animal foods. The point wasn't just abstention, but demonstrating that your spiritual commitment didn't diminish your cultural refinement. Even your restrictions could be performed with flair. Food wasn't just what you ate, it was who you were, where you stood, and what heaven permitted you to consume. Meals weren't for enjoyment, they were performances of status, ritual, and your place in society. And like everything else in Imperial China, one wrong move at the table could cost you more than just your appetite. It could cost you your position, your reputation, or sometimes even your life. Having navigated the perilous terrain of proper dress and survived the minefield of mealtime etiquette, you now face perhaps the most demanding aspect of life in Imperial China, your daily labor. The concept of work-life balance would have been as alien to ancient Chinese as smartphones or democracy. Work wasn't something you did, it was who you were, dictated by the social category you were born into, and performed until your body or spirit broke, whichever came first. Let's start with the scholar officials, those ink-stained aristocrats of the mind sitting atop the social pyramid. You might envy their clean hands and absence of calluses, but their labour was mentally crushing. A district magistrate, the lowest rung of the imperial bureaucracy, was responsible for everything in his jurisdiction: tax collection, crime prevention, dispute resolution, infrastructure maintenance, ritual observances, and disaster management, all while satisfying the demands of superiors who could end his career with a single memo. Imagine working in a system where you are personally responsible for events beyond your control. Drought in your district, your fault, perhaps your moral failings angered heaven, bandit raid, you failed to maintain order. Even if you somehow navigated these challenges, you faced another impossible task: enforcing imperial policies that were often unrealistic or contradictory, while still appearing loyal to the throne. The mental gymnastics required would exhaust any modern executive. A typical day for a magistrate began before dawn with administrative work, followed by court sessions hearing civil and criminal cases. Afternoons might involve inspecting dikes, granaries, or skulul, followed by evening banquets with local elites to maintain crucial political relationships. Add in endless paperwork using a writing system so complex it took decades to master, and all while maintaining the precise rituals and appearances we discussed earlier. Your off hours spent composing poetry and practicing calligraphy to demonstrate your cultural refinement. Retirement wasn't a concept. You served until you died or were dismissed, often in disgrace. For the farmers, who comprised 80–90% of the population, work was brutally physical rather than mental. The agricultural calendar governed every aspect of life with an iron rhythm that hadn't changed for millennia. Spring planting required breaking soil with primitive wooden ploughs, often pulled by family members when draft animals weren't available. Summer meant endless weeding under a merciless sun, standing knee-deep in water for rice cultivation. Fall harvest demanded weeks of non-stop cutting, threshing and storing and all while calculating how much would go to the landlord and tax collector versus how much your family might keep to survive the winter. There were no days off, literally none. Even on festival days, animals still needed feeding, water still needed carrying, and countless chores still demanded attention. The concept of vacation would have seemed like madness. A bad harvest meant starvation, so every daylight hour, and many before dawn and after dusk, was dedicated to coaxing sustenance from the soil. The physically broken bodies of elderly peasants told the story of decades of this relentless toil. Artisans had their own special form of exhaustion. Take a potter, for example. His day began by mining and carrying heavy clay, then spinning his wheel with foot power for hours while maintaining perfect pressure with his hands. The precision required for imperial-grade porcelain was staggering. Any flaw meant destroying the piece and starting over. Kilns required constant tending at specific temperatures, often operating through the night. The physical demands combined with a craftsman's exacting standards created a uniquely demanding profession. Most artisans learned their trade through apprenticeship beginning in childhood. A woodcarver's apprentice might spend years just learning to hold tools correctly before being allowed to work on actual projects. The relationship between master and apprentice wasn't sentimental. It was often harsh, with physical punishment for mistakes and years of menial labour before learning actual skills. By the time you became a master yourself, your body was already breaking down from the repetitive strain of your specialised movements. Merchants, though often wealthy, paid for their prosperity with other forms of labour. Long-distance traders spent months away from home, risking bandit attacks and navigating different dialects and customs. Their physical journeys were matched by mental calculations, profit margins, exchange rates, bribes for officials, protection money for local strongmen, all while being socially despised as parasites who created no tangible goods, despite providing the networks that kept the empire functioning. Even within the household, labour never ceased. Women's work remained largely invisible, but was no less demanding. The curse of the 3-inch shoes we discussed earlier didn't exempt women from exhausting labour. With bound feet, women still spun thread, wove cloth, sewed garments, preserved food, and managed complex household affairs. The pain of their deformed feet added an additional layer of suffering to every task. Upper-class women supervised servants but still performed the crucial work of maintaining family connections and training children in proper behaviour. For the very lowest classes, the mean people we mentioned earlier, labour was often combined with social exclusion. Butchers, tanners, and executioners performed necessary work that was considered polluting or degrading. Night soil collectors who emptied cesspits worked in horrific conditions but were essential to urban agriculture. Actors and prostitutes provided entertainment but remained social outcasts. Their labour carried a double burden of exhaustion and shame. Most shockingly to modern sensibilities, there was no concept of childhood as a protected time. Children as young as 3 or 4 began contributing to family labour, gathering firewood, watching younger siblings, or feeding animals. By age 6 or 7, they were performing meaningful work in fields or workshops. Their small fingers were particularly valuable in certain industries like silk production, where children would pluck silkworms from boiling water in conditions that would horrify any modern observer. What tied all these forms of labour together was their inescapability. You didn't choose your profession in Imperial China. It chose you through birth and circumstance. The farmer's son would farm, the blacksmith's daughter would marry another craftsman. The official's child would study the classics. Social mobility existed in theory through the examination system, but in practice generations followed generations along the same occupational paths, performing the same tasks in the same ways. There were no weekends, no vacations, and certainly no work-life balance, just endless labour interrupted by ritual observances and the occasional festival, themselves forms of work with their own demanding preparations. Your occupation wasn't what you did, it was who you were, continuing the eternal cycle that had sustained China for millennia before you were born and would continue long after you were gone. After navigating the exhausting world of labour, where your occupation consumed your identity, you might think home offered some respite, a place to relax, be yourself, perhaps even find comfort. That assumption would be your first mistake in understanding Imperial Chinese family life. Your family wasn't a haven from society's demands. It was society's most fundamental enforcement mechanism, where hierarchy, obligation, and ritual reached their most intimate and inescapable form. The cornerstone of Chinese society wasn't the individual or even the state. It was the family, governed by principles of filial piety so absolute they would make modern helicopter parents look like neglectful guardians. Confucius placed family devotion at the centre of all virtue, and over centuries this philosophy hardened into an iron framework controlling every interaction between family members. The classic of filial piety didn't suggest respecting your parents. It demanded complete, unquestioning obedience to their every wish, even after their death. Parents in Imperial China didn't just have authority over their children, they had legal power of life and death. Until the Tang dynasty, a father could kill his children without legal consequences. Even after reforms, parents maintained the right to sell children into slavery or servitude, arrange marriages without consent, and physically punish offspring of any age. This wasn't considered abuse, it was proper discipline, and neighbours or officials would rarely intervene, viewing family matters as private unless they disrupted public order. The obligation to obey parents didn't end with adulthood. A 70-year-old man still needed to obey his 90-year-old mother without question. Stories that circulated as moral exemplars illustrated the extremes expected. A man who tasted his elderly father's feces to diagnose illness. An official who resigned his position to personally nurse his sick mother. A son who sat without moving by his father's grave for years. These weren't viewed as extraordinary acts, but as minimal expectations of decent conduct. Even in death, parents controlled their children's lives through elaborate mourning rituals. When a parent died, a son entered formal mourning for 3 years, actually 27 months, during which he withdrew from public life, dressed in coarse hemp clothing, abstained from meat and wine, and lived in a hut beside the grave. Officials suspended their careers, merchants closed their businesses. Even emperors theoretically observed these practices, though typically in modified form due to state necessities. The multi-generational household formed the basic unit of society. 3 or 4 generations living under one roof wasn't just common. It was the ideal, celebrated in art and literature, and incentivized through tax policies. Imagine sharing your living space with your parents, grandparents, unmarried siblings, wife, children, and perhaps brothers and their families, all arranged in strict hierarchical order. The oldest generation occupied the best rooms, the youngest slept in whatever space remained. Privacy simply didn't exist as a concept. Your sleeping quarters might be separated by thin paper screens at best. Personal desires were subordinated to family needs. Your marriage wasn't about finding a compatible partner, but about securing a daughter-in-law to serve your parents and produce male heirs. Your career choices weren't about personal fulfillment, but about bringing honor and resources to the family. Even your emotional expression was regulated. Excessive grief or joy was considered disruptive to family harmony. The family was also your only safety net. There was no social welfare system, no government support for the elderly or disabled. If you didn't have children to care for you in old age, you faced destitution. This created immense pressure to produce sons, leading to female infanticide in poor families who couldn't afford to raise children who would eventually join another family. A family without sons faced extinction not just biologically but spiritually, as only sons could perform the ancestral rites necessary to sustain deceased relatives in the afterlife. Ancestral worship formed another layer of family obligation. The dead weren't gone. They remained active family members requiring regular offerings, rituals, and consultation. The ancestral tablet in the family shrine contained the spirits of your forebears, who watched your behavior, blessed family undertakings if properly respected, and caused misfortune if neglected. Daily incense, regular food offerings, and elaborate festival ceremonies kept them appeased. Your ancestors weren't historical figures, they were supervisors evaluating your every action against family traditions. Family identity completely overshadowed individual identity. Your personal name was rarely used. You were addressed by your relationship title: second son, elder sister, third uncle. Your accomplishments and failures reflected on your entire lineage. An official who accepted bribes brought shame to ancestors 7 generations back and descendants yet unborn. A scholar who passed the imperial examinations brought glory to the entire extended clan. You existed not as yourself, but as a link in a chain stretching across time. Within this system, women faced particularly restrictive circumstances, as we've touched on earlier. A bride joined her husband's family as its most junior member, subordinate to everyone, including younger brothers-in-law. Her primary duty was producing sons, with her value measured by her reproductive success. A woman without sons could be divorced, or forced to accept a concubine into the household. Her relationship with her husband was secondary to her relationship with his mother, who directed her daily activities and could subject her to harsh discipline for perceived inadequacies. Children weren't viewed as developing individuals, but as miniature adults requiring correction. Discipline began early and was often physical. The saying, "spare the rod, spoil the child," had its Chinese equivalent: to rear without education is the father's fault. Education meant not just academic learning, but rigid instruction in proper behavior, with stories of virtuous children who set themselves on fire or sold themselves into slavery to benefit their parents, serving as role models. Childhood wasn't protected innocence, it was preparation for a lifetime of obligation. All family dynamics served one primary goal: continuation of the family line. Individual happiness, personal fulfillment, romantic love. These modern concerns would have seemed not just selfish, but actively harmful to the greater purpose of maintaining family continuity across generations. The worst fate imaginable wasn't personal suffering, but family extinction, having no descendants to maintain ancestral worship and carry the family name forward. Your family wasn't just who you loved, it was your government, your religion, and your prison. It sheltered you, but at the cost of your autonomy. It provided identity, but obliterated individuality. It offered security, but demanded complete submission. And like everything else in Imperial China, it wasn't designed for personal happiness, but for sustaining an ancient order that prioritized stability over the desires of any single heart beating within its elaborate cage. Having explored the suffocating embrace of family obligation, let's now examine what might be the most alien concept to modern sensibilities: marriage in Imperial China. If you're imagining romance, personal choice, or emotional fulfillment, you're already approaching this from the wrong universe. Marriage wasn't about love. It was a transaction between families, a political alliance, an economic merger, and above all, a necessary step in the eternal mission to produce male heirs. The process began with matchmakers, professional negotiators who shuttled between families assessing compatibility, not of the prospective couple who remained strangers, but of their ancestral lineages, zodiac signs, and family resources. Think of them as ancient merger and acquisition specialists, except they were usually older women with connections throughout the community. These matchmakers evaluated everything from a family's reputation to the bride's foot size to the groom's examination prospects, seeking not romantic chemistry but favourable business terms. The negotiations could take months or years with extensive documentation, divination and background investigations. In elite families, genealogical records were scrutinised to ensure no common ancestor within 5 generations, a far more stringent requirement than modern incest prohibitions. Horoscopes were compared to predict compatibility. Family wealth was assessed, dowry and bride price amounts debated, and the bride's domestic skills evaluated. Throughout this entire process, the young people themselves had absolutely no say. In fact, the couple typically met for the first time on their wedding day. The bride, hidden behind a red veil, would be carried in a sedan chair to the groom's family home, where elaborate rituals formalised her transition from her father's family to her husband's. After kowtowing to heaven, earth, the groom's ancestors, and his parents, she would finally be allowed to lift her veil and see her husband's face, the man who now owned her completely, whom she was expected to serve for the rest of her life. Wedding ceremonies weren't celebrations of love, but ritual transfers of a woman from one family's authority to another's, with careful attention to avoid spiritual contamination. The bride wore red for luck and fertility, covered her face to prevent evil spirits from following her, and was carried over threshold fires to purify her passage. These weren't quaint traditions. They were deadly serious protective measures against supernatural forces that might disrupt the family's continuity. After the wedding came the wedding night, where a bride faced not just the awkwardness of intimacy with a stranger, but the pressure of witnesses. In elite families, servants might remain in the room to verify consummation, or relatives might wait outside for proof in the form of blood-stained sheets. Sex wasn't private, it was a family business, with a bride's fertility becoming public property the moment she entered her husband's home. The pressure to immediately conceive a son was enormous, with monthly failures noted and criticised by the entire household. Romantic love wasn't just unnecessary, it was potentially dangerous. The classic Chinese love stories that did exist, like the butterfly lovers or the story of Ying Ying, typically ended in tragedy, serving as cautionary tales rather than aspirational narratives. Excessive emotional attachment between spouses was seen as a threat to the proper Confucian order, which placed parent-child bonds above husband-wife relationships. A man who prioritized his wife's happiness over his mother's wishes was severely criticized. For men of means, marriage to a principal wife didn't preclude other sexual relationships. Concubines, women legally bound to a man but of lower status than wives, were common in wealthy households. These arrangements weren't considered infidelity but legitimate family extensions. The principal wife managed these concubines, who were essentially sexual servants also expected to produce sons. Imagine the psychological reality, supervising your husband's other sexual partners who lived in your household or being one of those partners permanently subordinate to your sister wife. The resulting household politics were Byzantine. A principal wife held power over concubines but remained vulnerable if she failed to produce sons, while a concubine succeeded. Concubines competed for their master's favour, which meant better treatment and resources for their children. Children of different mothers lived together as siblings of varying status, with a concubine's son ranking below the wife's daughter despite the general preference for males. Every relationship was mediated through this complex hierarchy, creating a hothouse of suppressed resentments and strategic alliances. For ordinary people who couldn't afford concubines, marriage was still primarily functional. A wife's value lay in her labour capacity, fertility, and family connections. A good match brought additional working hands to the family enterprise, whether farm or workshop. Peasant marriages might involve somewhat less elaborate negotiations but followed the same principles. Family interests superseded individual preferences. If attraction developed after marriage, it was a fortunate accident, not a prerequisite. Divorce existed but remained rare and heavily restricted. A husband could divorce his wife for 7 reasons, including failure to bear a son, talking too much, or disrespecting his parents. A wife had essentially no grounds to seek divorce unless her husband abandoned her completely. Even then, a divorced woman faced severe social stigma and economic hardship, often compelled to become a servant or enter a Buddhist nunnery. Most endured even abusive marriages rather than face such consequences. Widowhood presented another perilous transition. A widow technically had the option to remarry, but elite families strongly discouraged this. especially if she had borne sons. The ideal was the chaste widow who remained loyal to her dead husband, raising his children in his family home and never remarrying, despite youth or financial hardship. Stone memorial arches commemorated these women who preserved their virtue, while those who remarried were condemned for having 2 husbands. For many widows, suicide was considered more honourable than remarriage. For women, alternative lifestyles existed only at the margins. Some wealthy women in the late imperial period formed sworn sisterhoods, vowing never to marry and living together in community houses. These arrangements required substantial family wealth and tolerance. At the other extreme, courtesans and prostitutes operated outside conventional marriage, but remained socially stigmatized despite sometimes achieving fame for their artistic accomplishments. Neither offered a recognized legitimate alternative to marriage for most women. The emotional reality of these arrangements is difficult for modern people to comprehend. How do you build intimacy with a stranger chosen by others? How do you share living quarters and raise children with someone selected through divination and financial negotiation? The answer is that romance wasn't expected. Duty, proper behaviour, and eventually familiar companionship were the goals. Passion was for poetry, not marriage beds. Romance wasn't just forbidden, it was seen as dangerously individualistic, a selfish indulgence that threatened family harmony. In Imperial China, marriage wasn't about 2 hearts joining as one, it was about 2 family lines connecting to produce the next generation. Love, if it grew at all, was expected to develop after years of shared duty, child-rearing and survival. And like everything else we've explored, marriage wasn't designed for personal happiness. It was another institution engineered for stability across generations, regardless of the emotional cost to any individual caught in its elaborate, ancestor-haunted cage. Having survived the transactional marriage market and produced the required heir, you now face perhaps the most consequential duty in Imperial China: raising and educating children. If you're imagining gentle nurturing or child-centered development, discard those notions immediately. Childhood in Imperial China wasn't a protected time of innocence and exploration. It was preparation for a lifetime of obligation, the training ground where hierarchical values were literally beaten into young minds and bodies. From the moment of birth, a child's life was enveloped in ritual and superstition. Newborns weren't immediately named or celebrated. The high infant mortality rate made early attachment risky. Many families waited a full month before the formal naming ceremony, when the child received both a milk name for everyday use and a formal name recorded in the family register. Until then, they might be called little bug, little dog, or other diminutive terms to confuse malevolent spirits who might snatch a valuable human child, but wouldn't bother with an insect or animal. This spiritual vulnerability continued through early childhood. Children wore protective amulets, caps with embroidered tigers or Buddhist symbols, and clothing with extra stitching at the collar resembling centipedes, all designed to ward off evil influences. These weren't cute accessories, but deadly serious spiritual armour, in a world where supernatural forces constantly threatened family continuity. A child's survival wasn't just a matter of physical health, but of proper spiritual protection. Education began almost immediately, not with alphabet songs or colourful picture books, but with lessons in proper behaviour. By age 3, children learned to bow correctly to family elders, speak with appropriate deference, and use honorific terms for each relative. A child who failed to show proper respect faced immediate correction, often physical. The saying, "hitting is caring, scolding is loving," encapsulated the philosophy that harsh discipline demonstrated proper parental concern. For boys, formal education typically began around age 6 or 7, starting with the 3-character classic, a primer written in 3-character lines that children memorize completely before understanding its meaning. Imagine forcing first graders to memorize thousands of characters before explaining what they meant. Students recited these texts in unison at the top of their lungs while facing away from the teacher, creating the din known as the sound of reading that was considered essential to proper learning. The physical environment of traditional Chinese education would horrify modern parents. Children sat on backless benches for hours, required to maintain perfect posture while memorizing texts. The teacher carried a bamboo switch and didn't hesitate to use it for infractions like slouching, mumbling, or showing insufficient enthusiasm. Winter classrooms remained unheated. Summer studies continued despite oppressive heat. Physical discomfort was considered character building, a preview of the hardships of adult life in examination halls. The curriculum centered on the Confucian classics, texts written in archaic language that required years to master. Children memorized the 4 books and 5 classics word for word, character by character, often without comprehension, until later study provided context. The goal wasn't creative thinking or personal development, but perfect reproduction of ancient wisdom. Innovation was actively discouraged. The phrase "I think" was considered presumptuous coming from a student. For boys from elite families, this educational regimen could last decades, with the ultimate goal of passing the civil service examinations we'll discuss in the next section. For most boys, however, formal education ended after a few years of basic literacy, followed by apprenticeship in the family trade. Farmers' sons learned agriculture by doing it alongside their fathers. Artisans' boys began sweeping workshops at 5 or 6, gradually learning their craft through observation and increasingly complex tasks. Girls received a dramatically different education. While elite families might provide daughters with literacy and cultural training to make them more valuable as future wives, their primary education focused on domestic skills, sewing, cooking, household management, and proper behaviour. The female classic taught to girls to be modest, industrious, and above all obedient. Crafts like embroidery weren't just decorative accomplishments, but demonstrations of the patience and precision expected in all female endeavours. For girls from ordinary families, education was purely practical. By age 7 or 8, they were already contributing significantly to household labour, watching younger siblings, feeding animals, helping with cooking, spinning thread, and beginning the painful process of foot binding if their family followed that custom. Their training focused on maximising their value as future daughters-in-law, their ability to work while requiring minimal resources. Across all social classes, children were not viewed as individuals with unique needs, but as miniature adults requiring correction. The concept of developmental stages didn't exist. Children were simply imperfect versions of what they should become. A child's resistance to learning or discipline wasn't seen as a phase, but as a character flaw requiring immediate remediation, often through physical punishment or public shaming. Discipline methods would qualify as abuse by modern standards. Caning was routine for academic errors or behavioural infractions. Kneeling on chains or gravel for extended periods punished more serious transgressions. Some schools used the finger press, a device that painfully squeezed fingers to enforce proper brush technique or punish mistakes. These weren't considered extreme measures, but normal pedagogical tools ensuring proper development. Stories that circulated as moral exemplars for children illustrated the extreme standard of filial behaviour expected. The 24 examples of filial piety included tales of children who sacrificed themselves for parents, a boy who allowed mosquitoes to feed on him rather than disturb his parents' sleep, a child who lay on ice to melt it and catch carp for his sick mother, a son who tasted his father's excrement to diagnose illness. These weren't viewed as disturbing, but as inspirational models for emulation. Parents participated fully in this severe approach to child rearing. A father who failed to discipline his children harshly faced criticism from extended family and community. The mother who showed excessive tenderness was considered harmful to her child's development. As one proverb stated, "A child spoiled by his mother will be destroyed by the world." Harsh parenting wasn't cruelty, but preparation for a harsh society where strict hierarchy governed every interaction. Even play was purpose-driven. Boys' games often involved scholarly competitions or military skills. Girls practiced domestic tasks through their recreation. Toys were minimal and typically educational. Miniature tools, simple puzzles, tops with character symbols. Free play was limited by both cultural constraints and the practical reality that most children were working members of the household from a very young age. Childhood wasn't protected innocence, it was preparation for a life of obligation. What might be most alien to modern sensibilities was the absence of praise in traditional Chinese child-rearing. Children weren't congratulated for achievements, but criticised for falling short of perfection. Praise was thought to breed complacency. Criticism spurred improvement. The rare compliment might be delivered indirectly, perhaps to another family member within the child's hearing. Direct praise was considered harmful to proper character development. Childhood wasn't just preserved innocence, it was preparation for a life of obligation. The harsh methods weren't seen as cruel, but as necessary training for a world where hierarchy, duty, and precision determined survival. Children weren't raised to be happy, they were raised to be correct, to fulfill their obligations without complaint. and to perpetuate the same system with their own offspring. The family's needs, not the child's, determined every aspect of development. You've seen how children were raised with harsh discipline and relentless education, but that was just the warm-up. The true gauntlet of Imperial China's meritocracy awaited: the examination system. A beautiful idea in theory. Anyone could become a government official regardless of background. But in practice, it was mental torture elevated to an art form. First, let's be clear about what you're facing. The imperial examinations weren't just tests. They were a multi-decade obstacle course designed to break your spirit while pretending to elevate it. You've spent your childhood memorizing the Confucian classics, over 400,000 characters of ancient text without truly understanding their meaning, just reciting them like a human parrot. Your father probably started you at age 3 or 4, making you trace characters until your small fingers blistered, because he knew the odds. Less than 1% of candidates would ever reach the highest levels. The system had 3 main hurdles, each more soul-crushing than the last. You begin with the prefectural exams held in your local district. Imagine thousands of men crammed into a testing compound, each assigned an examination cell barely larger than a coffin, and that's not hyperbole. These cells, arranged in endless rows, measured roughly 3 feet wide by 5 feet deep. Too small to fully stretch your legs, too narrow to lie down properly. Just you, a plank for writing, and a second plank that functioned as both seat and bed for multiple days. You're searched before entering, guards checking every seam of your clothing for hidden notes. They strip you down, poke through your hair, inspect your ears, even check your mouth. Caught with cheat sheets? That's not just failure, it's exile or worse. Some desperate scholars tattooed passages onto their bodies or wrote microscopic notes on small pieces of paper hidden in hollowed-out writing brushes. Guards found most of them. The lucky ones were merely banned from future exams. The unlucky ones were executed. Once inside your cell, you receive the exam questions. No multiple choice here. You're writing 8-legged essays, rigidly structured compositions with 8 distinct sections, each requiring perfect calligraphy, flawless grammar, and extensive quotations from texts you've spent decades memorizing. One smudge, one error, and your paper goes in the rejection pile. The format is so rigid that originality is punished, not rewarded. Your task is to reproduce orthodoxy perfectly, not to think. You stay in this cell for 3 days and 2 nights, no leaving, except for the crude communal toilet trench. You relieve yourself in full view of guards and fellow candidates, then quickly return to your cell. Some candidates, especially older ones in their 50s or 60s, yes, many took these exams throughout their entire lives, died during the process. Guards simply removed the bodies and testing continued. Passed this initial exam? Congratulations. You've earned the title of budding talent. Now prepare for the provincial examination held only every 3 years. The format is similar but more demanding, more days confined, more essays required, more competition. Maybe 1 in 100 will pass. You might take this exam 10 times over 30 years and still fail. Many did. The reward for provincial success is the coveted title of Juran, elevated person. Now you're somebody, but still not enough to secure a government position. For that, you need to pass the metropolitan examination in the capital, followed by the palace examination in front of the emperor himself. Only 300 people every 3 years would achieve this highest jinshi degree. 300 out of a country of hundreds of millions. The psychological toll was immense. Candidates routinely suffered mental breakdowns. Examination dreams, nightmares of failing, of blank pages, of brush strokes turning to snakes were so common they became a literary trope. Suicides at examination compounds happened often enough that officials developed protocols for handling them. Some candidates went mad, filling their papers with nonsensical characters or blood. Even more crushing, success was never guaranteed regardless of knowledge or preparation. Examination graders were human with human corruption. Powerful families found ways to influence results. Some candidates paid fortunes to have imposters take exams for them. Others bribed officials for advanced knowledge of questions. And if you succeeded, after devoting your entire life to these examinations, you became a government official, working yourself to death with administrative duties while navigating court politics that could get you executed for a single misstep. Your decades of studying poetry and ancient texts barely prepared you for managing flood control, tax collection, or famine relief. The cruelest irony? After conditioning your mind to regurgitate ancient wisdom rather than solve real problems, the system then expected you to manage complex social crises with nothing but maxims from 500 BCE. When floods devastated provinces, your Confucian education taught you more about proper ceremonial responses than hydraulic engineering. Most heartbreaking were the failures who spent their entire lives trying. Every village had them. Aging scholars, impoverished after decades of study, still mumbling classical passages, still dreaming of the next attempt. Many took exams well into their 70s, sometimes carried to the examination compound on stretchers, dying with brush in hand rather than abandoning the dream. Remember those mean people from our social hierarchy section? They couldn't even take the examinations. Actors, butchers, boat people, prostitutes and their children, all permanently excluded. The supposedly meritocratic system still maintained rigid barriers. Your village could pool resources to educate one promising boy for decades, only to have him blocked because his grandfather was a leather tanner. Women? Don't be absurd. The female mind wasn't considered capable of such scholarly pursuits. A handful of women throughout Chinese history disguised themselves as men to take the examinations, risking execution if discovered. Most were caught. Those who weren't became folk legends. So yes, Imperial China invented the world's first meritocratic civil service, but what you're envisioning as standardized tests were actually psychological endurance trials designed to produce officials who valued orthodoxy over innovation, memorization over critical thinking, and stability over progress. The examination system wasn't education, it was indoctrination, wearing the mask of opportunity. The world's first meritocracy was also its most elaborate torture chamber for the mind. After breaking your mind in the examination system, you'll likely need medical attention. Unfortunately, healing in Imperial China wasn't the science-based medicine you're accustomed to. It was a complex negotiation with cosmic forces using your body as the battlefield. And like everything else we've seen, your treatment depended entirely on your social position and wealth. Traditional Chinese medicine operated on principles utterly foreign to modern understanding. Your body wasn't a biological machine with discrete organs and systems. It was a landscape of energy channels where qi, vital energy, flowed like rivers. Disease wasn't caused by bacteria or viruses, concepts that didn't exist, but by imbalances between yin and yang forces, blockages in energy meridians, or disruptions in the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. This wasn't some fringe theory. It was the sophisticated culmination of over 2,000 years of observation, philosophy, and practice. The foundational text, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, was composed around 200 BC and remained medical gospel throughout the imperial era. Its elegant theories explained everything from seasonal illnesses to emotional disorders through correlations between the human body and the cosmos. Your diagnosis began not with laboratory tests, but with the 4 examinations: looking, listening/smelling, asking and touching. The physician would scrutinize your complexion, the coating on your tongue, the sound of your voice, and most importantly, the qualities of your pulse. Pulse diagnosis wasn't simply counting beats. It was an art form involving 3 positions on each wrist, 3 depths at each position, and dozens of pulse qualities with poetic names like string, choppy, slippery, or flooding. A master physician could spend 30 minutes just feeling your pulse, detecting subtle variations that supposedly revealed everything from liver stagnation to heart fire blazing upward. Was it accurate? Sometimes remarkably so. Other times about as reliable as consulting your horoscope. The treatments that followed this diagnosis ranged from brilliant to barbaric. Herbal medicine represented the pinnacle of pre-modern pharmacology. Imperial physicians catalogued thousands of substances, plants, minerals, and animal parts, with detailed preparation methods and specific applications. Many of these herbs contained genuine medicinal compounds: ephedra for asthma, artemisia for malaria, ginseng as an adaptogen. The imperial pharmacopoeia was vast, sophisticated, and sometimes actually effective. But alongside these legitimate remedies were substances prescribed based on sympathetic magic or pure desperation. Rhino horn for fevers, tiger bone for weakness, bear gallbladder for liver ailments, human breast milk in eye drops, cinnabar, mercury sulfide for longevity, ironically poisoning the patient slowly, deer antler velvet for virility, dried seahorses for kidney problems. Combinations could be even stranger. One famous formula called Break the Dragon Tablet in 7 parts contained everything from fossilized bones to scorpions. If you were wealthy, your prescription might consist of exotic ingredients imported from thousands of miles away. If you were poor, you made do with local plants or went without. The contrast was stark. An imperial concubine might receive rare ginseng for a minor complaint, while an entire village shared a single travelling doctor who visited once a season. Swallowing mystery herbs was just the beginning. Acupuncture, the insertion of needles into specific points along energy meridians, was widely practiced for everything from pain management to paralysis. Early needles were made of stone and bone before metallurgy allowed for finer instruments. These weren't the sterile, disposable needles used today. They were reused metal implements, sometimes rusty, sometimes cleaned only by wiping with silk or a quick pass through flame. Imagine lying still while a physician inserted up to a dozen needles into precisely mapped points on your body, twirling them to manipulate your qi, perhaps leaving them in place for an hour. For conditions like chronic pain or paralysis, the needles might be left in for days, held in place with clay or wax. Infection was common. Punctured organs happened. But when it worked, and sometimes it genuinely did, the results could seem miraculous. If needles weren't enough, there was moxibustion, burning dried mugwort on or near the skin to warm acupuncture points. The herb was either placed directly on the skin, creating permanent scarring, or on a slice of ginger or salt as a buffer. The smell of burning mugwort filled healing rooms across China, the small cone slowly turning to ash as patients endured first-degree burns in the name of health. Cupping therapy created vacuum suction on the skin, using heated glass or bamboo cups, drawing blood to the surface and leaving perfectly circular bruises. Guasha, scraping the skin with a smooth edge until it turned a bright bruised red, was a common home remedy for everything from heatstroke to the common cold. Both were excruciating but considered essential for drawing out heat or wind from the body. Surgery existed but was primitive and rare. Without effective anesthesia beyond wine, opium or acupuncture, operations were excruciating ordeals. The famous physician Hua Tuo supposedly developed an anesthetic called mafesan around 200 CE that could render patients unconscious for major procedures, but the formula was lost when he was executed for political reasons. Most surgery was limited to lancing boils, draining abscesses, or setting broken bones. Anything more invasive was likely to kill the patient through shock or infection. The only exception was surgery performed by military physicians during wartime, who developed advanced techniques for arrow removal and wound management through brutal necessity. Field surgeons might cauterize wounds with boiling oil or red-hot metal. Battlefield medicine was a blood-soaked education that produced some of China's most skilled physicians, if they survived their training. Childbirth, as we'll see in our next section, remained entirely in the realm of midwives rather than physicians. Male doctors were forbidden from examining female patients directly. Diagnoses for women were often made by taking the pulse through a string tied to the woman's wrist, passing through a screen that preserved her modesty while ensuring her inevitable misdiagnosis. Mental illness received surprisingly sophisticated theoretical treatment but barbaric practical care. Depression might be diagnosed as liver qi stagnation and treated with appropriate herbs, but severe mental illness could lead to exorcisms, restraints, or abandonment. Your doctor wasn't trying to cure a disease as we understand it today. He was attempting to restore harmony between opposing forces, regulate the flow of mysterious energies, and realign your body with the cosmos. Sometimes this worked beautifully. Other times, it killed you faster than the disease itself. Either way, you paid your physician only if you recovered, a system that encouraged both excellence and deception in medical practice. Your doctor wasn't just fighting disease, he was negotiating with cosmic forces using your body as the battlefield. If traditional Chinese medicine couldn't save you, and often it couldn't, you'd face the grim reality that defined life in Imperial China. Death was not a distant abstraction, but your constant companion. While physicians negotiated with cosmic forces using herbs and needles, death quietly claimed people at rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. Let's start with the moment of birth, which was less a celebration than a tentative hope. Infant mortality was so devastatingly common that many families didn't name their children for the first 100 days, a period called full month, after which a celebration marked the child's reasonable chance of survival. Before that milestone, around 20 or 30% of newborns had already died. It wasn't callousness that led parents to sometimes refer to their infants as little ones, rather than by name. It was psychological self-preservation against inevitable loss. Many families followed the 5 sons get 2 rule, meaning if you had 5 sons, you'd be fortunate if 2 survived to adulthood. For daughters, often less valued in the Confucian family system, care might be even less attentive, leading to higher female infant mortality, a demographic imbalance visible in population records across dynasties. Female infanticide, while officially condemned, was practiced during times of famine or extreme poverty, particularly in the late Ming and Qing periods. Assuming you survived infancy, childhood presented its own deadly obstacle course. Smallpox was so common it was simply called the seasonal illness, with periodic epidemics sweeping through villages and cities alike. By the Song dynasty, Chinese physicians had developed variolation, an early form of inoculation against smallpox, using dried scabs from mild cases, but the procedure itself killed 0.5 to 2% of those who received it. Still, this was considered an acceptable risk compared to the 20–30% mortality from natural infection. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and scarlet fever regularly claimed children who had survived the gauntlet of infancy. Intestinal parasites were nearly universal, acquired from contaminated water and undercooked food. Respiratory infections into winter could quickly become pneumonia without antibiotics, while simple cuts could develop into deadly infections. A scratch from a garden tool might kill you through tetanus, a mosquito bite through malaria. If you reached adulthood, you'd face new threats. For women, childbirth was perhaps the single greatest killer. Puerperal fever, infection following childbirth, claimed countless lives, as did hemorrhage, obstructed labour and eclampsia. Midwives, despite practical experience, had no effective interventions for these complications. A woman facing childbirth in Imperial China essentially gambled with death every time she conceived, with maternal mortality estimated between 1 to 5% per birth. With multiple pregnancies common, a woman's lifetime risk of dying in childbirth could approach 10–20%. Men faced their own mortality challenges. Labourers frequently died from accidents, hernias from heavy lifting, or exposure to toxic substances in mines and workshops. Scholars, contrary to their privileged position, often suffered from diseases of sedentary lifestyle, strokes, heart problems, and diabetes, then called wasting thirst disease. Soldiers died more often from disease in camp than from enemy weapons, though arrow wounds, sword cuts, and crushing injuries in battle were certainly fatal without modern trauma care. Epidemic diseases periodically ravaged the population regardless of social status. The density of cities like Chang'an, Kaifeng, or Beijing, with hundreds of thousands of residents living in close quarters without sanitation, created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century and later bubonic plague outbreaks killed millions. Cholera epidemics could depopulate entire districts in weeks. When such diseases struck, even imperial physicians with their exotic herbs were helpless, often attributing outbreaks to miasma, imbalanced qi, or heaven's displeasure with the emperor's virtue. Famines triggered by drought, flooding, or warfare brought slower death through malnutrition and associated diseases. During severe famines, historical records describe desperate measures, consuming tree bark, leather, clay, and even human flesh. The massive death tolls from these events were often followed by epidemics as weakened survivors fell victim to opportunistic infections. Life expectancy tells the brutal story. If you were fortunate enough to be born into the elite during stable periods, you might live to 60 or 70, though even emperors with the finest care rarely exceeded this range. For ordinary people, reaching 40 was an achievement. For the urban poor, soldiers, miners, and other dangerous occupations, 30 might be the average. These aren't just numbers. They shaped how people viewed time, opportunity, and purpose in fundamentally different ways than we do today. The ubiquity of death created a culture preoccupied with proper transitions to the afterlife. Remember the elaborate mourning rituals and ancestral worship we discussed? These weren't just traditions. They were psychological necessities for a society where death took someone from nearly every family every year. Funeral practices became incredibly elaborate, with families sometimes bankrupting themselves to provide proper burial and mourning for parents, a final demonstration of filial piety. Your relationship with death would be dramatically different than modern experience. You would have seen corpses regularly. During epidemics, they might pile in streets awaiting collection. You would have washed and prepared the bodies of family members, dressed them in burial clothes, and participated in multi-day funeral rituals. By adulthood, you would have attended dozens, perhaps hundreds of funerals. Death would be familiar, expected, even ordinary, but no less feared. This constant proximity to mortality shaped philosophy and religion. Buddhist teachings on impermanence and rebirth, Taoist pursuits of longevity and immortality, and Confucian emphasis on family continuity all responded to the omnipresent reality of death. The elaborate mourning rituals we discussed earlier weren't excessive in a world where death was so common. They were necessary social technology for processing grief that would otherwise overwhelm communities. In Imperial China, you wouldn't fear death as an abstract concept at the end of a long life. You would fear specific deaths, the lingering agony of tuberculosis, the swift horror of cholera, the shame of execution, the pain of injury without anesthesia. These weren't rare tragedies. They were common ends observed repeatedly in family members, neighbours and strangers. The brutal reality is that Imperial Chinese society functioned not despite this mortality, but in constant accommodation of it. Social systems, family structures, inheritance practices, and religious rituals all developed to absorb death's constant intrusions. Administrative systems accounted for the regular loss of officials to disease. Agricultural practices assumed periodic population reductions from famine and epidemic. Death wasn't a distant stranger, it was your constant companion, taking family members with regularity and randomness. With disease and death as your constant companions, you might assume Imperial China developed sophisticated sanitation systems. You'd be partially right and horrifyingly wrong. Chinese hygienic practices embodied the same paradox we've seen throughout. Sophisticated theoretical understanding paired with practical implementation that varied wildly based on social class and regional customs. What emerges is a picture where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was a luxury beyond imagination for most people. Let's start with urban environments, where the density of humanity created sanitation challenges that would make your modern stomach churn. Cities like Chang'an during the Tang dynasty or Beijing during the Ming housed hundreds of thousands of people in close quarters with waste management systems little advanced from the Neolithic era. The basic urban sanitation system consisted of night soil collectors, workers who gathered human excrement from communal latrines or individual households, carting it outside city walls to sell to farmers as fertilizer. This practical recycling system had commercial efficiency but tremendous hygiene costs. Night soil collectors, ranked among the mean people in the social hierarchy we discussed, typically used open wooden buckets, carrying them through narrow streets where sloshing and spillage were inevitable. The stench that permeated Chinese cities struck foreign visitors immediately, noted in virtually every European account from Marco Polo onward. Public latrines existed in larger cities, simple structures with bench seating over cesspits that were periodically emptied. These facilities lacked running water, toilet paper, wealthy Chinese used cloth or silk, while commoners used sticks, smooth stones, or simply water, or any real privacy. During hot summer months, the combination of flies, stench, and visible excrement created disease vectors of spectacular efficiency. Cholera, typhoid, and parasitic infections spread rapidly through these facilities. Indoor plumbing was almost non-existent. Even imperial palaces used sophisticated chamber pot systems rather than actual plumbing. Palace servants, often eunuchs, were responsible for emptying the porcelain vessels used by the imperial family, carrying waste through otherwise immaculate palace corridors. For wealthy households, the chamber pot was standard technology, usually emptied by servants into street gutters or dedicated cesspits. For everyone else, it meant trips to communal facilities or simply finding a quiet corner of a courtyard or alley. Streets themselves served as primary drainage. Most Chinese cities featured shallow gutters running along streets to channel rainwater, urine, food waste, and whatever else residents discarded. These gutters frequently clogged with debris, creating fetid pools that bred mosquitoes and spread disease. After heavy rains, streets became shallow rivers of mud mixed with human and animal waste, flowing wherever gravity dictated. The water supply was equally problematic. Most urban residents relied on communal wells, rivers, or water carried from springs outside city walls. Well water in densely populated areas was frequently contaminated by nearby cesspits, creating a deadly cycle where drinking water contained the very pathogens excreted by sick neighbours. Chinese physicians recognized that boiling water prevented illness, one of traditional medicine's most effective public health insights, but fuel costs meant many poor residents drank water untreated. Bathing practices varied dramatically by region and class. In northern China, particularly during winter, Full-body bathing might occur only a few times yearly. The wealthy maintained elegant bathing chambers with heated water carried by servants, while public bathhouses served the middle classes in larger cities. For peasants in rural areas, bathing might be limited to wading into rivers during summer months, or quick sponge baths using water heated for cooking. Many people might go weeks or months without washing their entire body, particularly during cold seasons. This doesn't mean personal hygiene was ignored. Most Chinese practiced regular face washing and hand cleaning, recognizing the connection between cleanliness and health. Cotton cloth face washers were wrung out in hot water each morning for a quick refreshing wipe. Hands were typically rinsed before meals, an important ritual in a culture where communal dishes were eaten with chopsticks. Spitting, however, was commonplace, with special containers provided for the purpose in better households. Oral hygiene consisted of rinsing with tea or salt water and cleaning teeth with willow twigs frayed at one end to form a primitive brush. Some used powdered herbs mixed with salt as dentifrice. Despite these efforts, dental problems were endemic, with tooth loss starting in early adulthood and often leading to malnutrition among the elderly, who could no longer chew properly. Clothing hygiene posed particular challenges. Laundering clothes required significant labour, heating water, beating garments on rocks and drying them, making it infrequent for most people. Upper classes changed their silk robes regularly, while peasants might own only 2 outfits worn until they literally fell apart. Body lice, bedbugs and fleas were constant companions, leading to scratching being so common it barely rated comment. Living spaces themselves presented health challenges. Traditional northern houses were heated by Kang bed stoves, raised brick platforms warmed by channeling kitchen smoke underneath before it exited through chimneys. While ingenious for conserving fuel, these systems often leaked carbon monoxide into sleeping areas. Southern homes faced different problems: damp environments that promoted mold growth and mosquito breeding, leading to endemic malaria in many regions. Urban housing consisted primarily of timber structures divided into ever smaller spaces as population density increased. Multiple families might share courtyard homes designed for single households, with shared cooking facilities and minimal privacy. Rodent infestations were universal. Rats and mice considered such inevitable companions that they featured prominently in the Chinese zodiac, rather than being viewed as controllable pests. The presence of domesticated animals complicated matters further. Chickens, pigs, and other livestock often shared living spaces with humans, particularly in rural households. These animals provided essential food security but created zoonotic disease transmission opportunities and contaminated living spaces with additional waste. Despite these conditions, it would be wrong to imagine Imperial Chinese were simply resigned to filth. Chinese culture placed high value on personal cleanliness within practical constraints. Wealthier households maintained meticulous standards, with servants dedicated to cleaning, and even poor families swept their humble dwellings regularly. The issue wasn't cultural attitudes toward cleanliness, but technological and resource limitations that made modern standards of hygiene impossible. The contrast between imperial palaces with their perfumed chambers and the teeming, waste-filled streets outside perfectly embodied the social stratification we've explored throughout. For the emperor, jade cups and silken wipes; for the commoner, wooden bowls and shared latrines; for officials, private gardens with ornamental ponds; for the urban poor, streets where raw sewage ran past their doorways after every rain. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was a luxury beyond imagination for most people. If disease, death, and unsanitary conditions weren't enough to make your life miserable in Imperial China, the legal system was ready to finish the job. Unlike modern justice systems theoretically built on presumption of innocence, Chinese law operated on the opposite premise. You were guilty until proven innocent, and the path to proving innocence often ran through your own blood and screams. Imperial Chinese law was codified with remarkable sophistication, evolving through dynasties into comprehensive legal codes. The Tang Code of 653 contained 501 articles covering everything from theft to treason. The Great Qing Legal Code was even more extensive, with detailed regulations for nearly every aspect of life. These weren't primitive or arbitrary laws, they were carefully reasoned, precedent-based legal systems administered by trained officials. The sophistication of the law, however, offered little comfort when you were kneeling before a magistrate. Let's follow what happened if you were accused of a crime, whether theft, assault, or simply offending someone with connections. First, you'd be arrested by Yamen runners. The magistrate's personal police force we'll discuss more in the next section. These weren't professional law enforcement, but hired thugs who supplemented meagre government salaries with whatever they could squeeze from prisoners. Your journey to justice began with a beating and a demand for bribes. Once at the Yamen, the local government office doubling as courthouse and prison, you'd face interrogation. The magistrate, a scholar official who passed those brutal examinations we discussed earlier, served as detective, prosecutor, judge, and jury combined. His job was not to objectively evaluate evidence, but to extract a confession, considered the king of evidence in Imperial Chinese law. Why the obsession with confession? Magistrates were evaluated by their superiors based on case resolution rates. Unresolved cases could damage their career prospects, while a near-perfect conviction record suggested administrative competence. The incentive wasn't justice, but efficiency. A confession simplified everything. To obtain this confession, torture wasn't just permitted, it was standardized. The Tang Code established authorized tortures that could be legally applied during the interrogation. These included beating with bamboo rods of specified dimensions, finger crushing with special devices called finger presses, and kneeling on chains. Each torture method was regulated. Officials couldn't exceed certain numbers of blows or duration of crushing were carefully calculated to inflict maximum pain while theoretically preventing death during interrogation. The most common torture was beating with the bamboo rod. You would be stretched face down over a bench, your pants removed, and struck on the back of the thighs and buttocks. The pain was excruciating, causing tissue damage, bleeding, and sometimes permanent injury. Officials were technically limited to a specific number of blows, but creative counting or simply ignoring the limits was common practice. For more serious cases, finger crushing awaited. Your fingers would be placed between bamboo sticks bound together and slowly tightened with string. This exquisitely painful procedure could continue until bones shattered or you confessed. Women and the elderly were theoretically exempt from the heaviest tortures, but exceptions were routine when officials needed results. Under these conditions, false confessions were inevitable. Many confessed to crimes they hadn't committed simply to end the torture, figuring they'd receive punishment either way. Others implicated innocent associates under duress, expanding the circle of suffering. Once obtained, a confession was nearly impossible to retract. Attempting to do so would simply result in more torture for obstruction. With confession in hand, sentencing followed. The legal codes prescribe specific punishments based on the crime's severity, the offender's social status, and various mitigating or aggravating factors. The say punishments form the backbone of the penal system, though their exact nature evolved over dynasties. The lightest was beating with a light bamboo rod ranging from 10 to 50 blows. This was considered minor punishment, often used for petty theft or minor regulatory violations. Next was beating with the heavy bamboo rod, 60 to 100 blows, severe enough to cause permanent injury or death, if applied to full force. For officials and elites, these beatings could be commuted by paying fines or through status privileges, another example of how even justice depended on social rank. Penal servitude sentenced convicted criminals to hard labour for terms ranging from 1 to 3 years. This might involve military service at dangerous border posts, labour in government workshops, or work in mines where conditions were often fatal. For many, this was effectively a death sentence through exhaustion and disease. Exile represented the fourth level of punishment, banishment to remote regions hundreds or thousands of miles from home. This wasn't just geographical relocation, but social death. Exiles performed hard labour in malarial regions or desert outposts, separated from family and ancestral temples. Remember the importance of family connections and ancestral worship we discussed. Exile severed those lifelines. The ultimate punishment was execution, itself graduated in severity. The merciful form was beheading, quick and relatively painless. For more serious crimes, especially treason or rebellion, there was lynching, infamously known as death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned would be tied to a post while executioners methodically removed small pieces of flesh until death finally came. This wasn't just about physical suffering, but spiritual destruction. Chinese beliefs held that preserving the body intact was necessary for the afterlife. Public humiliation accompanied most punishments. The wooden kang, a large, heavy board locked around the neck, forced criminals to display their crimes in public spaces. Unable to feed themselves or lie down while wearing this device, offenders depended on family or public charity to survive. Some died of exposure or starvation while wearing the kanga. family punishment extended justice beyond the individual. For serious crimes, especially treason, the 9 familial exterminations policy condemned 9 degrees of lativies to death. Parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren, siblings, and various cousins, aunts and uncles. This collective punishment reinforced family responsibility for individual behaviour. Even for lesser crimes, families often suffered confiscation of property or loss of status. Prisons themselves were not meant for long-term confinement but temporary holding while awaiting trial or execution. Conditions were abysmal, dark, filthy cells where prisoners were chained together, given minimal food, and subject to further extortion by guards. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with prison fever killing many before their sentences could be carried out. The worst aspect of this system wasn't just its brutality, but its uneven application. Those with money could bribe officials for lighter treatment or substitute criminals. Poor men paid to take punishment in place of the wealthy. Scholar officials enjoyed legal privileges that commoners didn't, while the emperor could pardon favourites regardless of evidence. Despite its sophistication on paper, the legal system of Imperial China wasn't designed to discover truth or ensure fairness. It was an instrument of social control, a mechanism to maintain hierarchy and stability through fear. The magistrate's primary concern was less about justice for the individual than preserving social harmony through visible fear-inducing consequences. Justice wasn't blind, it saw everything, especially your family connections and the size of your bribe. You've already seen how the law in Imperial China was less about justice and more about maintaining order through fear. But what happens in the shadows between those bamboo beatings and public executions? A vast ecosystem of corruption, extortion, and criminal enterprises that made daily life a constant negotiation with the underworld, both official and unofficial. Let's start with the people supposedly enforcing the law, yamen runners. These weren't dignified officers with badges and principles. They were poorly paid thugs employed by local magistrates to do the dirty work of arrests, investigations, and tax collection. And poorly paid is the key here, because their official salary barely covered their morning tea. So how did they survive? By squeezing you. Imagine you've been accused of a minor infraction. Perhaps a neighbour claims you've encroached on his land by 3 inches. Yamen runners arrive at your door not to investigate impartially, but to extract case fees before they even begin. No money? They might drag you through the streets in chains, not because you're guilty, but because public humiliation loosens family purse strings faster than polite requests. Your relatives will scrape together their savings to make the shame stop. If you did end up at the magistrate's court that we discussed in the last section, the extortion continued. Court clerks, document handlers, even the jailer all had their hands out. Want your case heard this year? There's a fee for expediting. Need ink for your statement? That costs extra. Would prefer not to be chained to a corpse in your cell? We can arrange something, for a price. The system wasn't corrupt. Corruption was the system. And remember those sophisticated legal codes we mentioned? They were so complex that most citizens couldn't possibly understand them without a legal expert, an unofficial position often filled by yamen runners themselves or their associates, who would helpfully explain, for a fee of course, how to navigate your case. It was like asking the wolf how to build your pig pen. Outside the official system, actual crime flourished despite, or because of, those brutal punishments we discussed. Banditry wasn't just a career choice, it was an alternative government in the countryside. Weak imperial control in remote areas meant bandits operated their own shadow taxation systems. Villages often paid regular protection fees to bandits rather than risk raids. Sometimes these arrangements became so formalized that bandits issued receipts, proof you'd already been robbed so other gangs would leave you alone. During the later Ming and Qing dynasties that you wouldn't survive in, some bandit groups grew large enough to field armies of thousands. They administered territory, collected taxes, and provided services the imperial government couldn't or wouldn't. The line between criminal organization and rebel government was tissue thin. Today's roadside robber might be tomorrow's warlord or even emperor. That's literally how the Ming dynasty began. In cities, criminal organizations were more sophisticated. Remember how certain occupations were considered beneath contempt? Those same mean people, butchers, actors, prostitutes, boatmen, often formed the backbone of urban gangs. Excluded from legitimate society and examinations as we saw earlier, they created parallel power structures. These weren't just street thugs, but elaborate brotherhoods with initiation ceremonies, blood oaths, and strict internal hierarchies. By the Qing dynasty, secret societies like the Heaven and Earth Society, Tiandehui, or the White Lotus Society blended criminal enterprise, mutual aid, religious practice, and anti-government sentiment into organizations that controlled entire neighborhoods. Their protection rackets were essentially unofficial taxes, yet another hand in your already empty pocket. Merchants trying to transport goods faced mountain tyrants, controlling vital passes and river dragons dominating water pools and each demanding payment. These weren't random hold-ups but institutionalized systems of extortion. Traveling merchants budgeted for these payments like modern businesses plan for taxes. They were simply costs of doing business. Corruption extended to the highest levels of government. Officials who had survived the examination torture we described earlier didn't suddenly become paragons of virtue. Having invested decades and family fortunes into obtaining positions, many felt entitled to recoup their investment. Mid-level officials might accept gifts for favourable judgments, overlook tax discrepancies for a fee, or sell government postings to underqualified candidates. At the imperial court itself, eunuchs, we'll discuss them more later, often controlled access to the emperor, creating an elaborate marketplace where policies and appointments were essentially auctioned to the highest bidder. During the late Ming dynasty, the eunuch Wei Zhongxian controlled a corruption network so vast that almost no official appointment or government decision occurred without his profit. The system was so normalized that honesty became the radical position. Even the military wasn't immune. Commanders reported ghost soldiers to pocket their salaries, sold exemptions from service, and embezzled supply funds. When the Qing dynasty faced the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century, corruption had hollowed out imperial forces so thoroughly that bandit armies fighting for the government, yes, bandits hired to fight other bandits, proved more effective than regular troops. For ordinary people like you, corruption wasn't an abstract political issue. It was a tax on existence itself. Need a permit? Pay a bribe? Want your shipment to arrive unmolested? Pay protection? Need that land dispute resolved? Better outbid your neighbour for the magistrate's favour. Even religious institutions weren't immune. With temples and monasteries selling blessings, favourable divinations, and special funeral rites to the desperate and grieving. The most insidious part? This system was self-reinforcing. Reporting corruption meant challenging people with power over your life, livelihood, and family. Whistleblowers rarely ended well. The smart strategy wasn't fighting corruption but learning its rules, who to pay, how much, and when. Many people accepted minor official malfeasance because at least it was predictable, unlike the arbitrary violence of criminal gangs or the even more frightening machinery of proper imperial justice we explored in the previous section. So yes, Imperial China had sophisticated legal codes, elaborate governmental structures, and harsh punishments for wrongdoing, but the space between the ideal and reality was where most people actually lived, navigating a grey world of kickbacks, protection rackets, and institutionalized extortion. You wouldn't survive because you've been taught that corruption is a bug in the system, not a feature. In Imperial China, it was the operating system itself, and you'd crash before you learned to run it. If the legal system didn't crush you, if disease didn't claim you, and if corruption didn't bankrupt you, nature itself stood ready to erase your existence in Imperial China. While officials and bandits might negotiate their predatory relationship with you as we just explored, natural disasters recognized no bribes, respected no rank, and followed no law except devastation. At the heart of Chinese civilization lay its greatest blessing and most terrible curse, the Yellow River. Poetically named China's Sorrow, this wasn't just flowery language, it was a geological obituary for millions. The river carried enormous amounts of silt, over 1 billion tons annually, which gradually raised its riverbed until the water actually flowed above the surrounding countryside, held back only by earthen dikes maintained through forced peasant labour. When these dikes failed, and they failed often, the results defied comprehension. In 1887, the Yellow River flooded an area the size of England, drowning between 1 and 2 million people and leaving another 2 million homeless. Picture waking to the sound of rushing water, scrambling to your roof as your neighbours scream, watching entire villages dissolve while corpses and debris float past. There would be no rescue boats, no emergency shelters, no insurance claims. Just you clinging to whatever wouldn't wash away, hoping your stored food wasn't underwater. Unlike the examination system we discussed, which at least offered theoretical opportunity, or the legal system, which could sometimes be bribed as we've seen, nature offered neither advancement nor negotiation. Major Yellow River floods changed course so dramatically that the river's mouth moved hundreds of miles, shifting between outlets in the Yellow Sea and the Bohai Gulf. Imagine your entire province suddenly underwater, not for days but for years or decades. Your ancestral home, your family graves that we discussed as essential to your identity, all gone under a new inland sea. Even areas away from major rivers weren't safe. Seasonal monsoon rains regularly triggered landslides in mountainous regions, burying entire villages under tons of mud and rock in minutes. Without modern geology, these disasters struck with no warning, unless you counted the local fortune tellers' predictions, which were about as reliable as the corrupt justice system we just examined. When water wasn't destroying lives from above, drought was just as deadly from below. The North China Plain, home to millions, experienced severe droughts every 5 years and catastrophic ones every decade. During bad cycles, the ground cracked, wells dried up, and crops withered in the fields. No crops meant no food, and no food meant decisions no parent today could imagine. Which child do you feed? Which elderly relative receives the last cup of watery porridge? Unlike the disease epidemics we discussed earlier that might spare some through natural immunity, hunger discriminated only by age and strength. The government's response to these disasters ranged from inadequate to non-existent. The imperial system maintained granaries for exactly these emergencies, but as we saw in our discussion of corruption, these reserves often existed more on paper than in reality. Officials reported full storehouses to their superiors while selling the grain for personal profit. When disaster struck, the granaries mysteriously contained far less than recorded. You couldn't eat an official's lies, though many tried eating anything else: tree bark, leather, clay, and eventually the dead. Famine drove desperate behaviours that ruptured the Confucian order. Parents sold children to survive, or in worst cases, exchanged children with neighbours because they couldn't bear to eat their own. Cannibalism during major famines wasn't just recorded, it was sometimes organised, with human flesh openly sold in markets. The breakdown of social order during these periods made the corruption and crime we just discussed look positively civilized by comparison. Earthquakes added another layer of terror to daily existence. The 1556 Shanxi earthquake killed an estimated 830,000 people, the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. Many peasants in the region lived in yaodongs, cave dwellings carved into soft loess soil. When the quake hit, these collapsed instantly, burying entire communities alive. Even conventional structures offered little protection in a country where earthquake-resistant building techniques were unknown, and the karmic interpretation of disasters discouraged practical mitigation. Beyond these major catastrophes lurked regular environmental hazards that would break a modern person within days. Locust swarms could darken the sky and strip fields bare in hours, turning a promising harvest into famine. Winter temperatures in northern China routinely plunged below freezing with minimal heating beyond small charcoal braziers, insufficient against the bitter cold that penetrated homes built without insulation. Summer brought sweltering heat, mosquitoes carrying malaria, and the ever-present risk of food spoilage in an age without refrigeration. For Imperial Chinese, these disasters weren't just physical events but moral communications. The emperor ruled through the mandate of heaven, which we touched upon earlier. Natural disasters were interpreted as heaven's disapproval of either the emperor's personal virtue or his government's conduct. This cosmic political theory turned every flood, drought, and earthquake into a potential regime crisis. When disasters struck, government responses were shaped by this belief. Officials might ban certain foods, order special prayers, or perform elaborate rituals rather than focusing exclusively on practical relief. Imperial edicts sometimes blamed disasters on specific moral failings, too much luxury, insufficient filial piety, or the kind of corruption we just explored, rather than recognizing their geological or meteorological causes. For you as an ordinary person, this meant living in a world where disaster wasn't just deadly, it was meaningful in ways that distorted relief efforts. The officials who might help you were busy defending their own positions against accusations that their moral failings had triggered heaven's wrath. Your suffering wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a political token in court debates about cosmic harmony. You wouldn't survive because the margin between life and death in Imperial China was paper thin, and nature regularly tore through it with indifferent brutality. Unlike today's world of weather forecasts, earthquake-resistant buildings, and disaster relief agencies, you'd face nature's fury with nothing but inadequate technology, corrupt institutions, and the cold comfort that your drowning, starvation, or burial alive might contribute to a philosophical debate about the emperor's virtue. Nature wasn't something to appreciate from climate-controlled comfort. It was an unpredictable force that could erase your family, village, and future in a single afternoon. If natural disasters weren't enough to end your fragile existence in Imperial China, human violence stood ready to finish the job. While heaven sent floods and earthquakes without discrimination as we just discussed, warfare brought a special kind of calculated brutality that made even the harshest natural disasters seem merciful by comparison. The peaceful, harmonious China of poetic scrolls and elegant court rituals existed primarily in the imagination. The actual history of Imperial China was punctuated by such regular and devastating conflict that entire dynasties collapsed and rose in blood-soaked cycles. The idyllic agrarian life we've examined was frequently interrupted by armies moving across the landscape like human locusts, consuming everything in their path. Let's start with the most terrifying reality: being caught between competing armies during a dynastic transition, when the mighty Han, Tang, or Ming dynasties began to crumble, often weakened by the corruption we explored and the natural disasters we just discussed. Multiple contenders emerged to claim the mandate of heaven. Their battleground, the farm you tended, the village you called home, the district where your ancestors had lived for centuries. Unlike modern warfare with professional armies and at least theoretical rules of engagement, pre-modern Chinese conflicts directly targeted civilian populations. Armies lived off the land, which is the poetic way of saying they took your food, animals, and possessions at spear point. Refusing meant death. Hiding resources was treason. The passage of an army, any army, meant starvation for those left behind with empty granaries and scorched fields. You think you'd just flee? To where? Neighbouring areas were either suffering the same military predation or had closed their borders to refugees. Major conflicts created masses of displaced people who died on roadsides from exposure, disease, and hunger. During the Anlushan rebellion of the Tang dynasty, an estimated 36 million people, 2/3 of the registered population, vanished from census records through death or displacement. The Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century killed between 20–30 million. These aren't just statistics, they represent countless individual tragedies like yours would have been. Even more terrifying than dynastic civil wars were foreign invasions. The northern frontier of China faced relentless pressure from nomadic peoples whose military prowess regularly overwhelmed imperial defences. The Xiongnu, Khitans, Jurchens, Mongols, and Manchus all took turns breaching the empire's borders and wreaking havoc. The Mongol invasion under Genghis Khan and his successors was particularly devastating. Some regions lost 90% of their population. City dwellers faced special horrors. When armies breached city walls, the civilian population experienced a trinity of atrocities: killing, looting, and sexual violence. The Mongol conquest of Changzhou in 1275 ended with the extermination of its entire population, over 1 million people. When the Ming capital of Nanjing fell to Manchu forces in 1645, soldiers were given 3 days of unrestricted plunder. The results were so horrific that even hardened military officials were shocked. We've discussed how women's lives in Imperial China were already constrained by foot binding and confinement to inner chambers. During warfare, they faced sexual violence on a mass scale. Upper-class women often committed suicide rather than face dishonour. So common was this practice that elite families sometimes trained their female members in methods of taking their own lives. This wasn't just cultural preference, it reflected the very real horrors that awaited women in captured cities. Even in times of relative stability, you might face conscription, a death sentence by another name. The imperial government maintained its armies through a military household system and direct drafts during emergencies. Unlike the examination system we explored that at least dangled the possibility of advancement, military service offered mostly suffering. Common soldiers received minimal training, inadequate equipment, poor food, and no medical care. Combat was brutally primitive. Before gunpowder became common, battles involved direct hand-to-hand combat with spears, swords, and bows. The wounds inflicted by these weapons were horrific and, given the state of medicine we've discussed, almost always led to infection and death if they didn't kill immediately. Armies also suffered catastrophic losses to disease. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of military camps were perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. If you somehow survived combat, you faced the equal danger of your own government. Desertion was punishable by death, yet armies were often left unpaid and unfed for months. The infamous White Lotus Rebellion began when desperately hungry troops started plundering civilian areas after the government failed to provide their rations. Many major rebellions throughout Chinese history were initiated by military units that effectively became bandits out of necessity. The corruption we explored earlier was especially rampant in military affairs. Officers reported false troop numbers to pocket extra pay, sold exemptions from service and embezzled supply funds. The result was armies that existed impressively on paper, but proved hollow in reality. During the First Opium War, China's military weakness, partially due to decades of corruption, was exposed when relatively small British forces defeated much larger Chinese armies and navies. Even peace wasn't truly peaceful for border regions. The northern frontier experienced near-constant low-level conflict. Border populations lived in fortified villages and faced regular raids. Farmers worked their fields in groups with weapons close at hand. Children stood sentry duty looking for dust clouds that might indicate approaching horsemen. This wasn't occasional, it was daily life for generations. By the late imperial period, internal rebellion became as dangerous as external invasion. The White Lotus, Nian, and Taiping rebellions all reflected deep social dysfunction. These weren't just political movements, but apocalyptic responses to the suffering caused by natural disasters, corruption, and governmental failure. When the Taiping forces captured Nanjing, they didn't just establish a temporary rebel base. They created an alternative government that controlled much of southern China for over a decade. The most bitter irony: common people rarely benefited regardless of who won these conflicts. When the dust settled and a new dynasty established itself, whether Chinese or foreign, the same demands for taxes, labour and obedience resumed under new management. The Confucian hierarchy we explored remained intact, the examination system continued with minor modifications, and the common people returned to their fields, fewer in number, traumatised, but still bound to the eternal cycle of imperial obligation. So yes, while natural disasters might erase your village in an afternoon as we just saw, war could destroy entire regions over years or decades. The China of elegant poetry and philosophical refinement existed alongside, and was frequently interrupted by, episodes of violence so extreme they defy modern comprehension. Empires rose and fell while peasants died, regardless of which dynasty's flag flew overhead. Amid the corruption, natural disasters, and warfare we've just explored, you might think Imperial Chinese turned to religion for comfort. They did, but not in ways you'd recognize or survive. The spiritual landscape of Imperial China wasn't just unfamiliar, it was a labyrinth where missteps invited both worldly punishment and supernatural retribution. Unlike the neat separation of church and state you're accustomed to, Imperial China's religious world was a complex fusion of philosophies, folk practices, divination, ancestor worship, and state cults, all operating simultaneously without contradiction. The famous three teachings of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism didn't compete but complemented each other in what scholars call syncretism, but what you'd experience as spiritual whiplash. Confucianism, which we've referenced throughout our journey, wasn't technically a religion but a social philosophy with religious dimensions. It dominated the examination system we explored and shaped the family structures we dissected. For the educated elite, Confucian rituals provided structure, but these weren't optional cultural practices. They were mandatory performances with political consequences. Failing to properly venerate ancestors or observe mourning periods could end careers, as we saw when discussing the examination system. Taoism offered something different: mystical practices for health, longevity, and harmony with nature. But Taoist practices included alchemy that could kill you through mercury poisoning, breathing exercises that could cause hallucinations, and sexual techniques that, well, let's just say they weren't designed for pleasure as we understand it. Court-sponsored Taoist priests performed elaborate rituals to protect the state, while local Taoist healers offered treatments that ranged from effective herbal medicine to dangerous quackery, as we saw in our discussion of traditional Chinese medicine. Buddhism entered China from India and transformed both itself and Chinese culture. Buddhist monasteries dotted the landscape, offering services from funerals to moneylending. But don't imagine peaceful meditation retreats. These were complex institutions deeply embedded in the corruption systems we discussed. Wealthy families donated land for merit, creating powerful economic entities that sometimes functioned like corporations. During periodic imperial persecutions, these same monasteries could be disbanded overnight, their property seized, and their monks forcibly returned to lay life. Beneath these formal traditions bubbled a vast sea of folk religion, the actual spiritual practice of most Chinese. Every village had its local deities, often former humans elevated to divine status. These weren't gentle guardians, but temperamental powers requiring constant propitiation. The kitchen god reported family behavior to heaven annually. Door gods protected against evil spirits. The god of wealth needed regular offerings to ensure prosperity. This wasn't quaint superstition, it was survival. When we discussed natural disasters, we mentioned heaven's disapproval as their cause. Folk religion provided the tools to manage heaven's mood through divination, sacrifice, and ritual, but these tools came with crushing financial obligations. Even the poorest families spent precious resources on incense, paper offerings, and temple donations. During the wedding and funeral rituals we explored, religious expenses often drove families into the debt cycles that fed the corruption systems we examined. The spirit world wasn't abstract, it was immediate and dangerous. Ghosts of those who died wrongfully or without proper burial haunted the living, causing illness, crop failure, and misfortune. Remember those executed criminals from our discussion of law and punishment? Their angry spirits required special handling. Ghosts of women who died unmarried or in childbirth were particularly feared. Professional exorcists made good livings banishing these entities, but their services weren't cheap, creating another financial burden. Demons represented an even greater threat. Unlike ghosts who were once human, demons were malevolent supernatural beings intent on causing harm. They could possess the living, causing the mental illnesses we touched on when discussing medicine. Protection against demons required amulets, charms, and geomantic arrangements of buildings and furniture according to feng shui principles. Getting these wrong invited disaster. The calendar itself was a religious instrument. Each day had auspicious and inauspicious qualities affecting every activity from travel to haircuts. The wrong day for a wedding condemned the marriage. The wrong hour for a funeral harmed the deceased's afterlife chances. Professional fortune tellers consulted complex almanacs to determine these matters, for a fee of course feeding into the systems of financial extraction we've been examining throughout. Even the emperor, that living god we discussed at the beginning, was enmeshed in religious obligation. The imperial cult maintained that the emperor connected heaven and earth through elaborate sacrifices at places like the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. These weren't optional ceremonies but cosmic necessities. A mistaken ritual could bring natural disasters like those we just discussed. During the summer solstice, the emperor performed rituals at the altar of the sun. During the winter solstice, he sacrificed at the altar of heaven. At the altar of agriculture, he personally ploughed a ritual furrow to ensure good harvests. The pressure this placed on ordinary people was enormous. Local officials mirrored imperial rituals, forcing community participation regardless of personal belief. During droughts, local magistrates might order fasting, animal sacrifices, or religious processions. Refusing to participate marked you as unfilial and uncooperative, dangerous labels in the legal system we explored. Religious festivals punctuated the year with financial demands. The Hungry Ghost Festival required offerings to ancestral spirits. The Mid-Autumn Festival demanded expensive mooncakes. The New Year necessitated new clothes, special foods, and gifts. For families already living on the edge of subsistence, as we've discussed, these obligations pushed many into debt or the criminal activities we explored earlier. Religious life also reinforced gender hierarchies. Women were generally excluded from official Confucian rituals, yet expected to maintain domestic shrines and prepare ritual foods. Female mediums channeled spirits but faced suspicion and sometimes persecution. Buddhist and Taoist nunneries offered rare spaces of female autonomy but were frequently targeted during anti-religious campaigns. By the late imperial period, heterodox religious movements posed political threats that triggered brutal suppressions. The White Lotus Society, which we mentioned when discussing rebellions, combined Buddhist millennialism with martial arts and anti-Manchu sentiment. These weren't just spiritual organizations, but alternative social structures offering escape from the oppressive systems we've explored, which is precisely why the government found them so threatening. The most disorienting aspect for you as a modern person would be the absence of religious choice. You didn't identify as Confucian or Buddhist or Taoist. You participated in all these traditions as needed. Religious identity wasn't about personal belief but social role. The idea that you might personally reject ancestor worship or refuse to participate in community rituals would be as bizarre and threatening as announcing you no longer plan to breathe oxygen. So while you might think religion would provide comfort amid the harsh realities we've explored, it actually added another layer of obligation, expense, and anxiety. The spirit world wasn't separate from daily life. It was entangled in everything from meal preparation to business decisions, another complex system you'd need to navigate with expertise you couldn't possibly possess as an outsider. And unlike our world where religious error might invite awkwardness, in Imperial China it could bring both worldly punishment and supernatural calamity, neither of which you'd be equipped to handle. You've now seen how Imperial China crushed individuals through its social hierarchies, legal systems, gender constraints, and even its religious practices. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this civilization was its relationship with innovation and science, a story of brilliant potential repeatedly sacrificed on the altar of stability. Imperial China gave the world paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, 4 inventions that revolutionized human history. Chinese astronomers tracked supernovas centuries before Western counterparts. Engineers built earthquake detectors, chain pumps, and suspension bridges, while Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. And yet this same civilization repeatedly stifled innovation, turned inward, and prioritized cultural continuity over progress. This wasn't accidental, it was by design. The imperial bureaucracy we explored when discussing the examination system wasn't created to foster creativity, but to maintain order. Remember those 8-legged essays that demanded rigid adherence to format and classical interpretation? They trained minds to look backward, not forward. Innovation requires questioning. The examination system rewarded memorization. While European universities were beginning to emphasize empirical observation, China's scholarly class remained tethered to ancient texts. Astronomy offers the perfect example of this paradox. Chinese astronomers kept meticulous celestial records stretching back millennia, far more comprehensive than any Western dataset. They accurately calculated the length of the solar year, predicted eclipses, and tracked guest stars, novae and supernovae, with remarkable precision. But this impressive science wasn't pursued for discovery. It existed to maintain the imperial calendar and predict omens. The Imperial Astronomical Bureau wasn't a research institution but a political one. Its primary function was determining auspicious dates for imperial activities and interpreting celestial events as validation or criticism of imperial rule. When we discussed natural disasters, we noted their political interpretation as heaven's judgment. Astronomy served this system of cosmic politics rather than exploration. The court astronomers who failed to predict an eclipse could face execution, not exactly an environment conducive to testing bold new theories. Chinese mathematics developed algebraic methods centuries before the West, with techniques for solving equations that wouldn't appear in Europe until much later. Yet these mathematical innovations remained primarily tools for practical application, calculating taxes, measuring land, or determining calendar dates, rather than abstract exploration. The examination system's focus on classical texts meant mathematical genius was diverted into literary scholarship rather than further mathematical development. The same pattern emerged in medicine. As we saw when examining traditional Chinese medicine, physicians developed sophisticated pulse diagnosis, documented hundreds of herbs with genuine pharmacological effects, and performed remarkable surgeries despite limited technology. Yet medical innovation remained constrained by traditional frameworks of qi and 5-element theory. When Western anatomical knowledge began to challenge these models, conservative forces largely rejected this new information rather than integrating it. Perhaps most striking was China's brief but spectacular maritime age. Between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He commanded treasure fleets of hundreds of ships. Some nearly 5 times larger than Columbus's vessels would be decades later. These technological marvels visited Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and East Africa, establishing trade networks and projecting Chinese power across the Indian Ocean. Then, abruptly, the voyages stopped. The ships were left to rot, maritime records were destroyed, and China turned inward for centuries. This wasn't technological failure, but political choice. Confucian officials saw the voyages as expensive distractions from domestic priorities. They viewed foreign contact as potentially destabilizing to the social order we've been examining. And frankly, they were right. Innovation and discovery do threaten established hierarchies. The examination system bureaucrats we discussed earlier didn't want disruption. They wanted predictability. The same pattern played out with mechanical innovations. Chinese engineers created seismoscopes, water-powered artillery spheres, and even an early escapement mechanism for clockworks. Yet these remarkable devices remained curiosities rather than foundations for further development. When Jesuit missionaries brought European mechanical clocks to the Ming court in the late 16th century, they were appreciated as exotic toys rather than transformative technologies. Printing technology offers another example of this innovative stagnation. China invented both woodblock and immovable type printing centuries before Gutenberg, yet never experienced anything like Europe's print revolution. Why? Partly because Chinese writing required thousands of characters rather than a simple alphabet, making movable type less efficient. But equally important was control. The imperial government we've discussed throughout maintained strict oversight of publishing, limiting its revolutionary potential. Gunpowder followed a similar trajectory. Chinese alchemists discovered it while seeking elixirs of immortality, part of the Taoist practices we just examined. They developed bombs, landmines, and primitive firearms. Yet China never experienced a military revolution comparable to Europe's. Instead, imperial armies incorporated these weapons into traditional military structures without fundamentally reforming tactics or organization, contributing to the military weakness we saw in our discussion of war and invasion. By the late imperial period, this technological conservatism had devastating consequences. When European powers arrived with advanced weapons, navigational techniques, and scientific knowledge in the 19th century, China found itself outmatched. The same civilization that had once led the world in astronomy, mathematics, and engineering now struggled to comprehend how it had fallen behind. The painful irony is that this wasn't about capability. Imperial China produced minds of remarkable brilliance throughout its history, but these potential innovators operated within a system that valued stability over discovery, hierarchy over disruption, and precedent over experimentation. The examination system we explored channeled intellectual energy into mastering ancient texts rather than questioning natural phenomena. The social hierarchies we dissected discouraged merchants, the class most likely to apply new technologies, from gaining too much influence. The religious beliefs we just examined interpreted unusual natural phenomena as moral messages rather than subjects for investigation. For you, as a modern person, this environment would be intellectually suffocating. You've been raised to value innovation, to question authority, to pursue knowledge for its own sake. In Imperial China, these attitudes wouldn't just make you unsuccessful, they could make you dangerous. Suggesting a fundamental revision to astronomical models might be interpreted as challenging the emperor's cosmic role. Promoting a mechanical innovation that displaced traditional craftsmen could be seen as disrupting the social harmony Confucianism demanded. Even expressing curiosity about foreign ideas might mark you as suspiciously disloyal. The tragedy wasn't that Imperial China lacked creativity or intelligence. It possessed both in abundance. The tragedy was that these qualities were repeatedly subordinated to stability, continuity, and hierarchy. Individual brilliance was sacrificed for collective order. Potential revolutions in thought were carefully contained within traditional frameworks. Progress wasn't valued for its own sake, only for how it could maintain the eternal order of things. You wouldn't survive because your entire relationship with knowledge and innovation is fundamentally different. You've been taught that questioning leads to progress. Imperial China taught that questioning threatened harmony. You see technological change as inevitable and desirable. Imperial China saw it as something to be carefully managed and controlled. You expect science to overturn old ideas when evidence demands. Imperial China expected new observations to be reconciled with ancient wisdom, no matter how tortured the logic required. Imperial China's remarkable achievements and technological stagnation weren't contradictions. They were two sides of the same coin. A civilization that produced genius but channeled it towards stability rather than transformation. The system wasn't designed to unlock humanity's potential, but to maintain an eternal order in which innovation was just another tool for preserving what already existed, not for discovering what might be possible. After this journey through Imperial China's rigid social hierarchies, brutal legal systems, gender oppression, environmental disasters, wars, religious demands, and stifled innovation, the verdict is clear. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you're weak, but because you were never meant to survive there. Modern people aren't built for Imperial China any more than tropical fish are built for the Arctic Ocean. The most fundamental reason is something we've touched on throughout our exploration. Imperial China wasn't designed for individual fulfillment or personal happiness. It was engineered for continuity across millennia, a civilization that prioritized stability over innovation, hierarchy over opportunity, and collective order over individual rights. Your very concept of personhood is incompatible with the system we've examined. Consider everything we've discussed: the social hierarchy that determined your worth at birth, the examination system that promised mobility while functioning as intellectual torture, the gender dynamics that broke women's bones for beauty and confined them to inner chambers, the legal system that presumed guilt and extracted confessions through standardized torture, the corruption networks that turned governance into extortion, the natural disasters interpreted as moral judgments rather than geological events, the wars and rebellions that periodically erased entire regions, the religious obligations that enmeshed daily life in supernatural danger, the intellectual system that subordinated brilliant innovation to ancient precedent. These weren't bugs in the system, they were features deliberately maintained across dynasties to ensure continuity. The four occupations weren't just social categories but cosmic ones. Foot binding wasn't just fashion but control. Legal torture wasn't just punishment but theatre. Religious rituals weren't just superstition but social glue. Even the scientific stagnation we just examined wasn't failure but choice, stability valued above progress. What makes this civilization simultaneously magnificent and terrifying is that it worked for nearly 2,000 years. While European empires rose and fell, while the Middle East transformed through multiple religious and political revolutions, China maintained recognizable continuity. The Han Dynasty official would have recognized the basic social structures of the Qing dynasty 17 centuries later. That's not a bug, that's a feature. A feature built on the crushing of individual potential. The beautiful trap of Imperial China was its ability to make oppression seem natural and resistance unthinkable. The system wasn't maintained just through physical force, though we've seen plenty of that, from judicial torture to military conscription. It was maintained through a comprehensive worldview that connected heaven, earth, and humanity in a single cosmic order. To rebel wasn't just to break laws, but to violate the fundamental structure of reality. This is why adaptation would be impossible for you. You've been raised to see yourself as an individual with inherent rights, to question authority, to expect technology to improve your circumstances, to view traditions as choices rather than obligations. Imperial China operated on exactly opposite assumptions. Your deepest instincts about selfhood, from career choice to romantic love to intellectual curiosity, would mark you as disruptive at best and treasonous at worst. And yet, amid this brutality and constraint, Imperial China produced breathtaking beauty. The literature, calligraphy, painting, ceramics, architecture, gardens, and philosophy remain among humanity's greatest achievements. This wasn't despite the oppressive system, but partially because of it. The channeling of human creativity into approved forms, the emphasis on refinement within established boundaries, the valorization of tradition over innovation. That's the final paradox. Imperial China crushed individuals into conformity while simultaneously creating cultural treasures that still inspire awe. It prioritized stability at the cost of progress, maintaining an eternal present where your ancestors, you and your descendants would ideally live essentially identical lives, performing the same rituals, holding the same values, and occupying the same place in the cosmic hierarchy. What does this tell us about ourselves? Perhaps that our modern celebration of individual freedom, technological progress, and constant change isn't the only way to build a civilization. Imperial China offers an alternative model, one that achieved remarkable longevity by sacrificing exactly what we value most: individual self-determination. You wouldn't survive because your very existence, your expectations, values, and sense of self is built on assumptions that Imperial China deliberately and systematically rejected. The civilization wasn't built for individual happiness or self-expression. It was designed for stability across millennia, achieved by grinding individuals into perfectly shaped bricks in a wall that outlasted them all. In that eternal cycle of dynasty, disaster, and rebirth, your comfort, your dreams, and your modern sensibilities would be the first casualties.